The morning Nora Ashby signed the divorce papers, the sky outside the courthouse was the specific shade of gray that Pennsylvania saved for funerals and endings. She remembered noticing it through the tall, narrow window at the end of the hallway, the way the clouds pressed down flat and heavy over the city like a lid being closed on something. She signed where her attorney pointed. She didn't read the pages again. She'd already read them 6 times over the previous 3 weeks, each reading a fresh confirmation of everything she'd already lost, everything Marcus had already taken, everything the law had decided was fair and settled and done. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She walked out of the courthouse at 11:14 in the morning with a folder of documents under her arm and $47 in her checking account. That was what 11 years looked like when you reduced them to a number. $47. The number had a specific weight to it, light enough to be insulting, heavy enough to make her chest hurt every time she thought about it. Marcus had been thorough. She would give him that much. She'd always known he was thorough. It was one of the things she'd once admired about him, the way he approached every problem like it was a project with phases and deliverables and a clear path to completion. He'd approached the divorce the same way. Methodical, organized, patient in a way that only people with resources and attorneys on retainer could afford to be. He'd taken the house in Chestnut Hill, the 4-bedroom with the porch she'd refinished herself over 2 summers. The one with the kitchen she'd designed tile by tile from a magazine she'd torn pages out of for years before they could finally afford it. He'd taken the car, a claim based on financial contributions that his attorneys outlined in language so precise it sounded like surgery. He'd cleaned out the joint savings account the morning he filed, a move his lawyer called legally appropriate given the circumstances, a move Nora called something else entirely in the privacy of her own mind. He'd left her the furniture in the spare bedroom, which was generous only if you ignored that she had nowhere to put it. He'd left her a kitchen appliance set she'd bought before the marriage. He'd left her the folder of documents she now carried under her arm. And he'd left her $47 in a checking account that still had both their names on it until the final paperwork cleared. And he'd left her something else, though she wouldn't understand that for another 3 weeks. He'd left her a cabin. Not intentionally. That was the thing that would matter later, that would sit in her chest like a coal warming slowly in the dark. Marcus hadn't forgotten about the cabin out of generosity or grace. He'd forgotten about it because it was worth nothing, because it appeared in no financial disclosure as an asset of consequence, because his attorneys had looked at the property value assessment and decided, correctly by any rational measure, that a 900-square-foot structure in the Blue Ridge foothills of Western Virginia, assessed at $1 by the county tax office due to its state of structural disrepair, was not worth the paperwork. It had been listed in the asset column of their shared records exactly once, for years into the marriage, when Nora's grandmother Elsa had passed it to her through a will so brief it barely filled a single page. Marcus had glanced at the assessment and moved on. He was not a man who paid attention to things that didn't perform. Nora had been staying on the couch in her friend Darla's apartment in Harrisburg since the week she left the house in Chestnut Hill. Darla was generous with the couch, less generous with her opinions about Marcus, which she offered freely and without prompting at intervals throughout the day. Darla believed that opinions, like coffee, were most effective when delivered strong and often, and she acted accordingly. Nora was grateful for the couch and the coffee and even for the opinions, though she rarely said so out loud, because saying so felt like confirming that the situation was as bad as it was, and she wasn't ready for that particular confirmation. The apartment was small. Darla had a 7-year-old daughter named Priya who watched cartoons at a volume calibrated for concert halls and fell asleep every night on the floor of the living room surrounded by small plastic toys that Nora stepped on in the dark with the reliability of a woman being punished for something she hadn't done yet. She slept in 4-hour stretches, waking at intervals to the sound of street traffic and her own thoughts, which were never quiet and never kind in the middle of the night. She made lists in the dark. Job applications pending, 23. Callbacks received, 2. Second interviews, 0. The lists didn't help, but the making of them gave her hands something to do, gave her mind a framework that felt slightly more manageable than the formless anxiety that lived in the space between waking and sleeping. She'd worked in marketing before. Not glamorously. She'd spent 8 years managing content and communications for a mid-sized manufacturing firm outside Philadelphia, a job she'd been good at, a job she'd been proud of in the quiet way she was proud of most things, privately and without fanfare. She'd left the position 2 years into the marriage when Marcus's income made her salary feel unnecessary and his schedule made her presence at home feel important. She'd told herself it was a pause. She'd told herself she'd go back when the time was right. She hadn't understood yet that the time being right was not something that happened on its own. It required tending. So now she was 41 years old with an 8-year gap in her resume and a marketing landscape that had transformed itself completely in that time. A fact every recruiter she spoke to managed to communicate without saying it directly. She was not unemployable. She was, as one particularly cheerful HR representative had explained, a candidate with a re-entry challenge. Nora had thanked the woman and hung up and stared at the wall of Darla's apartment for 11 minutes before getting up and making coffee she didn't want. She found the cabin in the paperwork on a Thursday evening in late November, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Priya was asleep. Darla was watching something on her laptop with headphones on. The apartment was as quiet as it ever got, which was not very, but quiet enough for Nora to spread the folder of documents across the coffee table and go through them again, not for any specific reason, only because going through them felt like doing something, and doing something felt better than the alternative. She almost missed it. The property transfer document from her grandmother's estate was a single sheet, folded into thirds, tucked behind the asset disclosure summary, where she'd placed it 4 years ago and never looked at again. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with the side of her hand. Her grandmother Elsa's signature was at the bottom, the handwriting small and precise and slightly slanted, the way people wrote when they'd learned penmanship as a discipline rather than a preference. Nora read it twice, then held it under the lamp. Cabin and associated parcel, Blue Ridge Foothills, Hardy County, Virginia. Transfer of title, sole ownership, Nora Jean Ashby Napatton. Date of transfer, March 14th, 11 years prior. She sat with the paper in her hands and felt something she hadn't felt in several weeks. Not hope exactly. Something smaller and more cautious than hope. The sensation of a door that might not be locked. She remembered the cabin in the way you remembered something you'd visited once as a child and never returned to. Her grandmother had taken her there the summer Nora was 9. A long drive into the mountains that felt like driving out of the world she knew and into something older and quieter and less concerned with the things she'd been taught to care about. The cabin was small even then, tucked into the side of a hill under a canopy of trees so thick the sunlight came through in pieces. Elsa had called it her thinking place. She'd said it with a particular kind of pride, the way people spoke about things they'd earned rather than been given. Nora hadn't been back in 32 years. She didn't know what condition it was in. She didn't know if it was standing. She knew it was hers, legally and completely, overlooked in the divorce proceedings because $1 was not a number that commanded attention. She told Darla the next morning over coffee. Darla's response was immediate and delivered in the tone she reserved for things she found both absurd and concerning. A cabin, Nora confirmed. In the mountains. In the foothills, technically. Western Virginia. Darla set down her mug. Honey, I say this with love. If that place is worth $1, it is probably held together with good intentions and old prayers. Nora wrapped her hands around her own mug, feeling the warmth against her palms. I know. Do you even know if it's standing? I don't know anything about it. I haven't been there since I was 9. Darla looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone performing a rapid internal calculation. And you're thinking about going. I'm thinking it's mine, Nora said, which is more than I can say about anything else right now. Darla didn't argue further. She was a practical woman, and she understood, even if she didn't say so, that $47 and a couch in someone else's apartment was a specific kind of bottom, and that specific kinds of bottoms required specific kinds of action, even when those actions looked from the outside like terrible ideas. The news reached Marcus through a mutual acquaintance 3 days later, as news always found its way in the social geography they'd shared for a decade. Nora didn't know how he'd heard. She didn't particularly care. What she cared about was what Darla told her he'd said, relayed secondhand with the barely contained pleasure Darla took in delivering information she felt confirmed her general assessment of Marcus as a person. He laughed, Darla said, setting plates on the table with the pointed efficiency of someone who wanted Nora to hear the next part clearly. "When he heard you were driving to Virginia to look at a shack your grandmother left you, he apparently said, and I am quoting here because the exact words matter, 'Good luck with the outhouse.'" Nora ate her dinner without commenting. She was not a person who expressed anger loudly. She had learned, over 11 years with a man who found emotional displays distasteful, to feel things quietly and completely, to let them settle rather than scatter. She felt Marcus's laughter settle in her now, not like a wound, but like fuel, the kind that burns slow and clean. She left on a Saturday morning before dawn. Darla had pressed 4 $20 bills into her hand the night before, claiming it was money she owed from a dinner they'd shared months ago, which was not true, but was delivered with such conviction that arguing felt unkind. Priya had drawn her a picture of a cabin in the mountains, the crayon representation cheerful and slightly lopsided, with a sun in the corner that took up roughly a third of the page and a figure. Outside the cabin that Priya identified as Nora and that Nora thought looked more like a potato with arms, but which she folded carefully and put in her jacket pocket anyway. She drove a borrowed car, Darla's 12-year-old Honda, with a passenger window that wouldn't roll all the way down and a heat system that took 20 minutes to warm up in cold weather. It didn't matter. She had 4 hours of road ahead of her and a thermos of coffee and the specific, quiet determination of a woman who had decided that whatever she found at the end of that drive was going to be the beginning of something rather than the continuation of nothing. The drive took her south through Maryland and into the Virginia Panhandle, the landscape shifting gradually from the flat industrial corridors she knew into something that felt older, more deliberate. Hills began appearing where the land had been flat, rising at the edges of the highway like suggestions, like the land reminding itself that it had another shape it preferred. By the time she turned off the interstate, she was moving through country that had the quality of a place that didn't need to be seen to continue existing. The trees were bare in late November, their branches making complicated patterns against a sky that was low and gray and indifferent. The GPS signal flickered twice on the county road and died completely on the secondary road, which was paved in name only, a length of cracked asphalt that narrowed steadily until it was barely wider than the car. She drove by memory and by the handwritten directions she'd pulled from a 40-year-old letter her grandmother had sent to her mother, discovered in a shoebox at the bottom of Nora's storage unit the night before she left. The directions were specific in the way that people wrote before GPS made specificity unnecessary. Look for the split-trunk oak at the property line. The drive is gravel after that. Don't let the grade fool you, it's longer than it looks. The split-trunk oak was still there. She almost missed it, slowing too late, the tires crunching on gravel as she turned. The drive curved up and to the left through trees that pressed close on both sides, close enough that the Honda's mirrors brushed branches. The grade was exactly as the letter described, deceiving in its angle, the incline flattening out just when it felt like it should be steepening. And then, between two large oaks that had grown toward each other and almost met overhead, the cabin appeared. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Nora stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking through the windshield at what her grandmother had left her. It was standing. That was the first thing. It was standing, which was not a given, and which felt like a form of grace she hadn't expected to receive from a building that had been sitting alone in these mountains for God knew how many years without anyone to look after it. The structure was small, exactly as she remembered and smaller than memory had allowed, the roof low and steep and covered in moss that had spread from the edges inward in the patient way that living things claimed what they needed. The wood siding had gone silver gray with age and weather, not rotted but weathered to a kind of dignity, the way old things sometimes looked more themselves the older they got. A stone chimney rose at the left end of the roof, its mortar gray and settled, its top scattered with a nest of something that had been abandoned before winter. She turned off the engine and got out. The cold hit her immediately, sharper here than it had been in Harrisburg, the mountain air carrying a bite that was specific to elevation, drier and thinner and cleaner than the air she'd been breathing for weeks. She stood in the gravel drive and listened. Nothing moved. There were no cars on the road below, no planes overhead, no sounds from neighboring properties because there were no neighboring properties. Not for another mile in any direction according to the county parcel map she'd pulled up at the library before she left. Just trees and the distant sound of water somewhere below the property line, and the specific silence of a place that had been left alone long enough to forget it had ever been occupied. She walked toward the cabin slowly, not from caution, but from something she couldn't quite name. The grass around it was long and brown and flattened in places by winter, the stone path from the drive to the front door barely visible under it. She found the path by feel, following the slight hardness beneath her feet, and stepped up onto the porch. The porch boards held. She tested each one before committing her weight, but they held, solid enough, slightly soft in one spot near the left railing where water had found its way in over the years, but not structurally compromised. The railing itself leaned outward at an angle that suggested it was functioning more as a suggestion than a support at this point. She held it anyway, lightly, and looked out from the porch at the view her grandmother had chosen this place for. It stopped her breath. The hill dropped away below the cabin in a long, gradual slope through bare trees, and at the bottom of the valley a creek ran gray and silver in the November light, winding between rocky banks before it turned at the far edge and disappeared behind a ridge. Beyond the ridge, the mountains rose in layers, each one a slightly different shade of gray and blue, fading as they got farther away until the farthest ones were barely distinguishable from the sky. The view was enormous and quiet and completely indifferent to her presence, which was, she realized, the point. This was not a view that needed to be earned. It was simply there, the way mountains were there, without condition or expectation. She found the key on a nail under the porch railing where her grandmother's letter had said it would be, covered in rust but functional, and unlocked the front door. The inside smelled like time. That was the only way she could describe it later. Not mustiness exactly. Not the sharp smell of mold or damp, but something deeper and quieter, the smell of a space that had been sealed away from the world for years and had been slowly becoming more itself in the silence. The air was cold, colder inside than out in the particular way that old, uninsulated structures trapped cold and still and dark. She found the light switch by feel and flipped it, expecting nothing. The overhead light came on. A single bare bulb in a ceramic socket mounted to the ceiling beam, its light yellow and inadequate and somehow wonderful. She stood in the doorway and stared at it. The power was on. She hadn't expected that. She stepped inside and took stock slowly, moving her eyes around the space the way her father had taught her to enter an unfamiliar room, taking the whole thing before zeroing in on details. The cabin was one main room, maybe 20 feet by 18, with a stone fireplace on the left wall that matched the chimney she'd seen from outside. The floor was wide plank pine, gray with age, worn in the paths that people had walked for decades. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, plain and heavy, the kind built to last rather than to be admired, with 2 chairs pushed under it. Against the far wall was a kitchen area, a cast-iron stove that looked older than the cabin, a short counter, a single deep sink with a hand pump mounted above it. To the right, a doorway led to what appeared to be the only other room, small enough to be a closet, sized to be a bedroom. Everything was covered in dust. Not the casual dust of a few months, but the deep, settled dust of years, lying in layers on every horizontal surface, softening the edges of things, making the whole room feel like it existed just slightly out of focus. But nothing was destroyed. Nothing had been vandalized or damaged beyond what time and weather had done on their own schedule. The walls were solid. The ceiling showed one dark stain in the far corner where a nail had let water through, but the wood around it was dry. The fireplace screen was rusted but upright. Nora stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, completing a full circle, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The feeling that a space belonged to her. Not because she'd decorated it or renovated it, or made it match the image she'd built in her mind over years of magazine pages and Pinterest boards, but because it was hers by inheritance, by blood, by the simple fact that her grandmother had chosen to leave it to her and no one else. She spent the first hour doing what she'd spent months learning not to do in other circumstances. She took stock without judgment. She opened every cabinet in the kitchen area, which were 3 in total, rough-built from pine boards and hung on hand-hammered hinges. The first held 3 mason jars of something she didn't try to identify, and a stack of mismatched plates wrapped in newspaper dated 11 years prior. The second held cleaning supplies, a bottle of vinegar, a box of baking soda, a bundle of rags tied with twine. The third held a cast-iron skillet, a Dutch oven, and a long-handled ladle, all coated in old grease that had gone rancid with time, but which were structurally intact. She tested the hand pump over the sink, working the handle in long strokes until it coughed and complained, and finally produced a thin stream of brownish water that gradually cleared to a pale yellow, and then, after 2 minutes of steady pumping, ran cold and clear. There was a well. The well was working. She checked the small bedroom, which held a narrow iron bed frame with no mattress, a wooden dresser with 3 drawers, and a mirror mounted above it, its silvering gone brown and cloudy with age. The dresser drawers held linens, folded with the precise creases of a woman who had known how to fold things properly, and had done so even for objects that would sit alone in a mountain cabin for years. The sheets were yellowed but unrotted, the wool blankets slightly moth-eaten at the corners but whole. She pulled the blankets out and shook them over the porch railing, watching the dust rise in a cloud and drift away down the hill. By the time she finished the initial survey, the light had shifted from the flat gray of midday to the slightly warmer gray of early afternoon, which was as close to sun as the November sky was prepared to offer. She made a list on a notepad she'd brought, old habit from the working years, from the version of herself who'd managed projects with spreadsheets and color-coded folders. The list was not short. The roof would need to be inspected closely. The moss was trapping moisture and would eventually compromise the shingles if it hadn't already. The window frames were swollen from moisture cycling, the kind of damage that got worse with freeze-thaw repetition. The porch needed 2 boards replaced, and the railing needed to be reset before it became a hazard. The well pump needed to be assessed more thoroughly, because a working pump and a safe pump were not necessarily the same thing. But underneath all of that, running through the list like a current she kept returning to, was the basic and sustaining fact: the structure was sound. She could see it in the way the doors hung, slightly off from settling, but not racked. She could feel it in the floors, which gave a little underfoot in the way of old boards, but didn't flex in the way that meant joists were failing. The stone foundation was visible at the corners where the siding had pulled slightly away, and the stone was solid, mortared well, the kind of work done by someone who expected it to last rather than someone who expected it to be replaced. It could be livable. That was the thought she turned over carefully, the way you turn something fragile, aware of its weight and its potential to break. With work, real work, sweat and patience and no budget for contractors' work, it could be livable. And livable was a thing she needed to be. She lit the fireplace that evening using wood from the stack on the porch that was old enough to be perfectly dry and burned with the clean efficiency of wood that had been curing for years longer than intended. The light changed the room immediately, made it smaller and warmer and more particular, gave the shadows depth and the surfaces something to reflect. She sat at the wooden table with her notepad and her list and her thermos of cold coffee, and she made plans. She would need to call about the well water quality before she drank it. She would need to assess the roof from outside with a ladder she didn't have. She would need to find out whether the property had a septic system or an outhouse, and if the latter, where it was, and whether the word outhouse as Marcus had used it was a joke or an accurate description. She would need to find the property lines properly, understand what else the parcel included beyond the cabin footprint. She would need to figure out whether the power bill was current or whether some arrangement from her grandmother's estate had kept the account active, and if so, for how long. The list was long. The problems were real. The resources she had to address them were $47, 8 days of food she'd packed in a cooler, and the particular kind of stubbornness that forms in a person when everything they trusted has been taken from them, and they discover, in the space left behind, that the only thing remaining is themselves. She slept that first night wrapped in her grandmother's wool blankets, on the floor near the fireplace because the bedroom was colder than the main room and she hadn't brought a sleeping pad. She slept better than she had in 3 months. She woke to the sound of something she couldn't immediately place, a low, rhythmic sound from somewhere she couldn't locate, and lay still for a moment in the dark with the fireplace down to embers, listening with her whole body. The sound resolved itself after a moment into wind moving through the trees outside, a particular pattern created by the shape of the hillside, channeling the air in a way that made it sound almost deliberate, almost like something breathing. She lay there in the dark and thought about her grandmother. Elsa Patton had been born in 1929 in a small town in West Virginia, the daughter of a coal miner who died young and a mother who raised 3 children through the Depression with a combination of garden vegetables, bartered labor, and a quiet, iron-willed certainty that circumstances were not destiny. Elsa had come out of that childhood the way some people came out of fire, not unmarked but unbent. She'd moved to Pennsylvania in the early 1950s, married Nora's grandfather, a machinist who loved her steadily and without drama for 44 years until he died. She'd worked at the county library for 30 years. She'd kept her own books, her own garden, her own counsel. She had never spoken about money directly. This was a generation thing, and also an Elsa thing, a belief that finances were private in the way that certain griefs were private, not because they were shameful, but because they were personal. What Nora knew about her grandmother's financial situation was what she'd observed. The house was always warm, the pantry was always full, and Elsa never appeared to want for anything, while also never appearing to indulge. She drove the same car for 21 years. She wore shoes until they wore through. She gave gifts that were exactly right and never extravagant. What Nora had not known, what no one had known or thought to ask, was what Elsa had done with her money over those decades. Whether she'd spent it or saved it or put it into something else entirely. It was the kind of thing you assumed had been handled, settled, concluded, administered by the attorney who drafted the brief will and transferred the cabin. The kind of thing that didn't seem worth investigating because it had seemed, on the surface, like there wasn't much to investigate. Nora had not thought about this once in 11 years. She thought about it now, lying in the dark of the cabin her grandmother had called her thinking place, listening to the wind moving through the trees, and felt the thought settle in a way that was not yet particular enough to be called a suspicion. It was more like a question forming in the space where a question had never been needed before. A question about what her grandmother had meant by this place. What she'd meant by leaving it, specifically, to Nora. What she'd meant by the word thinking, and whether thinking was all she'd done here. She fell back to sleep before she could follow the question anywhere useful. In the morning, she found the trapdoor. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It wasn't concealed behind a panel or beneath a rug or under any surface that required specific knowledge to locate. It was in the floor of the small bedroom, visible the moment she moved the iron bed frame aside to check the condition of the boards underneath, which she was doing methodically, checking each plank for soft spots the way she'd been checking everything in this cabin. The trapdoor was there when the frame moved, a square cut in the floorboards, roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, with a simple iron ring set flush into the wood as a handle. The cut was clean and deliberate, the edges fitted tightly. It did not look like something added after the fact. It looked like something that had been designed to be there. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Her first thought was practical. Root cellar. Mountain cabins built before refrigeration often had root cellars, spaces beneath the floor for storing vegetables and preserved foods through winter. It would make sense. It would be entirely ordinary. It was probably a root cellar. She bent down and took hold of the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, solid wood with a ledge on the underside that let it seat cleanly in the frame. It came up smoothly, the hinges on the far side moving without the protest she'd expected from hardware that old. They'd been maintained. Recently, she realized, because old hinges that hadn't been used didn't move like that. They seized, they screeched, they resisted. These moved like hinges that someone had oiled within the last several years. Below the trapdoor was darkness and a set of wooden steps and a smell that came up toward her in the cold morning air of the cabin. Not the smell of vegetables or preserved food or the particular earthiness of a root cellar. Something different. Drier. Older. The smell of a space that had been sealed and kept deliberately, the way a room smelled when it had been protecting something for a long time. Nora crouched at the edge of the opening and shone her phone's flashlight down. The steps descended 8 or 9 feet into a space that was wider than a root cellar had any reason to be. She could see the edge of a wall at the bottom, stone, carefully laid, not the rough field stone of a hasty cellar, but fitted and mortared work that matched the quality of the chimney outside. The light reached only so far. The space beyond was beyond what the flashlight could reach. She sat with her hand on the iron ring and felt that cautious, careful thing stir again in her chest. The thing that was not yet hope, but was moving in that direction. The question that had been forming in the dark last night, becoming more particular now, more pointed, less comfortable. She thought about her grandmother, about 30 years at the library, about the car driven for 21 years, and the shoes worn through, and the gifts that were always exactly right. About the pride in the word thinking place, and the particular kind of pride that came from things earned rather than given. She thought about the fact that no one had been here in 11 years, that the hinges on this trapdoor had been oiled, that the power was still running to this cabin, that someone, recently, had been maintaining something down there, or that something had been left here so carefully, so deliberately, that it had maintained itself. She sat at the edge of the opening for a long time in the cold quiet of the mountain morning, looking down into the dark, while above her the bare trees moved in the wind, and the creek ran in the valley below, and the mountains stood in their layers of blue and gray against a sky that had gone. Finally, the pale gold of November's sun breaking through. Then she put her phone between her teeth for the light, and took hold of the top step, and began to climb down. The steps were solid, 9 of them, each one wide enough for a full footstep and deep enough that she didn't have to grip the rough-cut railing on her right to keep her balance. She counted them as she descended, the way she'd been counting everything since the divorce, measuring and cataloging and building the habit of inventory from whatever she had left. 9 steps. The temperature dropped as she went lower, not dramatically, but noticeably, the particular cold of the earth doing what earth always did, holding its own steady temperature regardless of what the seasons were doing above. The flashlight from her phone made a bright circle on the stone wall ahead of her, and a pale radius around her feet, and very little else. She reached the bottom, and stood, and raised her phone, and swept the light slowly left to right. The space was not a root cellar. She swept the light again, more slowly this time, making herself process what she was seeing rather than react to it. The room was perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, its walls dressed stone fitted with care, the mortar between courses clean and gray and old. The floor was packed earth, dry, covered in several places by rough wooden boards laid as walkways. The ceiling was low enough that she stood with only inches to spare, the floor joists of the cabin above her visible through rough planking. A single bare bulb hung from a wire stapled along the ceiling, with a pull string hanging down. She reached for it, already half certain nothing would happen. The light came on. She stood in the sudden yellow brightness and looked at what her grandmother had kept below her thinking place, and understood for the first time that the word thinking had been a kind of code. That Elsa Patton, who had driven the same car for 21 years and worn her shoes until they wore through, had been doing something down here that had nothing to do with sitting quietly and waiting for clarity. The walls of the room were lined with shelving, the same plain pine-board construction as the kitchen cabinets above, built to the same unpretentious standard, functional, solid, and built to hold weight. The shelves were holding weight. She could see that from the doorway, from the way the boards bowed slightly at their centers under what was stacked and arranged along their length. The objects on the shelves were varied in size and form, but they were packed with the density of a person who understood that space was not to be wasted, that every inch was an argument, and she was making hers with both hands. Nora moved closer. The first section of shelving was closest to the stairs, and what it held was immediately comprehensible. Mason jars, dozens of them, the wide-mouth quart variety that Elsa had used in her garden for as long as Nora could remember. But these weren't filled with tomatoes or pickled beans or summer corn. They were filled with coins. Old coins, she could see even at a glance, the kind that came in different colors than the currency she used every day, some with a dull copper shine, others with the particular warmth of old gold, others still in silver that had toned to gray rather than the bright finish of modern quarters. The jars were labeled in Elsa's handwriting, the small precise letters she'd pressed into strips of masking tape affixed to each lid. The labels were dates and categories. 1890s to 1910. Morgan's. 1913 to 1933. Barber's. She traced the labels slowly with one finger, reading them like a map of time. She didn't know coins. She had never owned a coin collection, never attended a coin show, never thought about old coins as anything other than the spare change you found in jacket pockets. But she understood the weight of the jars, the deliberateness of the organization, the fact that a woman who did nothing without purpose had stored these with care and labeled them with precision. She understood that purpose and care applied to objects usually meant those objects were worth caring about. She kept moving along the shelves. The next section held something different. Flat wooden trays, perhaps a dozen of them, stacked carefully with squares of felt between each one. She lifted the top tray and set it on the nearest workbench, a rough-built table against the far wall she hadn't noticed yet, and opened the felt. Inside were stamps. Postage stamps, rows of them mounted on backing paper, each one separated from the next, and from the felt by a layer of transparent protective sleeve. She had even less knowledge of stamps than of coins, but she could read the dates printed on them and understand that anything printed in 1869 and housed with this level of deliberate care was being treated as something precious. The stamps were small and vivid despite their age, their colors preserved in a way that normal objects 150 years old were not, because someone had understood that preservation required specific conditions and had created those conditions here, in this room, in the consistent cold of a mountain hillside where temperature didn't swing and humidity didn't fluctuate the way it did in a house above ground. She set the tray down and pressed both hands flat against the workbench, steadying herself. The third section of shelving held artwork, not paintings in heavy frames. Nothing she could have imagined carrying down those 9 narrow steps, but works on paper, carefully interleaved with what appeared to be acid-free tissue, stored flat in large shallow boxes that had been sealed at their edges with tape. She opened the top box gently, peeling the tape away carefully, and lifted one corner of the tissue. The paper beneath was cream-colored with age, the ink on it dense and precise, a print of some kind, a landscape rendered in lines and shadow that had the quality she'd only seen in museum rooms, the quality of something made to endure rather than to be consumed. She didn't know the artist. She didn't know what she was looking at, what period it came from, whether it was common or rare or anything in between. She only knew that it was here, in her grandmother's cellar, handled as if it mattered. She sat down on the floor of the cellar, which she had not planned to do, and looked at the room from that angle. The shelves ran the full perimeter except for where the stairs came down and where the workbench stood. Every inch of them was occupied. The lighting was inadequate from the single bulb, but in its yellow reach she could see the outline of the whole, the scope of what had been accumulated here, not randomly but deliberately and over time. A lifetime of time. A quiet life in which every dollar not spent on the car driven 21 years or the shoes worn through was pointed towards something she'd carried in her head alone, a project no one else had known about, and therefore no one else had been able to dismiss or diminish or take. Nora thought about Marcus, about his attorneys with their precise language and their asset disclosure summaries, about the house in Chestnut Hill and the car and the $47 she'd driven here with, about the way he'd laughed when someone told him she was going to a cabin worth $1. She didn't laugh. She was not the kind of woman who laughed at her own good fortune, not because she took it for granted, but because she understood instinctively that the moment had a gravity that deserved better than laughter. This was not a punchline. This was the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking, delivered by a woman who'd been dead for 11 years and who had known, somehow, that Nora would need it, who had trusted that she would come here and find it and understand what it meant. She understood. She pressed her hands flat against the packed earth floor and felt the cold of the mountain through her palms and thought about what she needed to do next, which was not panic and not celebrate and not call anyone until she knew what she was talking about. She needed to document what was here. She needed to understand what she had before she could understand what it meant. She needed, above everything else, to move slowly and carefully through this the way she'd moved slowly and carefully through the inventory of the cabin above, not with urgency or fear, but with the methodical attention of someone who had learned, recently, and at significant cost, that overlooking details was a form of poverty she could no longer afford. She went back up for her notepad and a second cup of coffee from the thermos. Then she came back down and started at the beginning of the first shelf and began, painstakingly, carefully, in her grandmother's precise tradition, to count. It was slow work. She couldn't identify most of what she was looking at. She didn't need to, not yet. She needed to know what was here, not what it was worth, and those were two different tasks requiring two different kinds of knowledge. She listed what she could see and describe. Mason jars of coins, 28 in total, varying contents, labels she copied faithfully onto her notepad. Flat trays of stamps. 14, each one sealed and labeled with dates and designations she didn't understand, but copied anyway. Flat boxes she assumed contained prints or drawings or other works on paper. 9. Wooden crates in the far corner she hadn't reached yet. 6. Sealed, their contents unknown and not labeled. It was the crates she sat with the longest. Not because she was impatient to open them, but because they were the only things without labels, the only things Elsa had chosen not to annotate. And that choice felt significant in the way all of her grandmother's choices felt significant once you understood that she was a woman who had done very little without reason. She didn't open the crates that day. She closed the trapdoor and went back above and sat at the wooden table with her notepad and her cooling coffee and the fire she'd built up again and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd found without trying yet to convert it into numbers or decisions or plans. Outside, the afternoon light was dropping toward the ridge, the pale winter sun making its early exit, the mountains going blue at their farthest edges. The creek in the valley was audible now in the stillness before dark, a constant murmuring that sounded like someone in another room talking quietly, steadily, about something they'd been meaning to say for a long time. Nora listened to it and thought about her grandmother and thought about the word inheritance, which she'd always understood as a thing you received and which she now understood as a thing you were entrusted with. The difference being the direction it was supposed to travel. You received things. You held things in trust, and then you passed them forward. She didn't know yet what she would find in the wooden crates. She didn't know yet what any of it was worth, what authenticating it would require, what process would stand between this cellar and whatever came next. She knew only what she had found, a woman's lifetime of quiet, deliberate work, hidden in a mountain hillside and waiting with the patience of stone for someone to come and be ready for it. She was ready. She had arrived at this particular readiness by the most painful available route, stripped of everything she'd built with someone who had never seen her clearly, left with exactly what she'd brought into the marriage, which was herself, and delivered to the one place that had been waiting for her without condition or expectation. She added one last line to her notepad, at the bottom of the inventory list, underlined twice the way her grandmother had underlined important things. "Do not rush this," she wrote. "This is the beginning." The fire crackled. The mountain held its cold and its quiet around the cabin. Somewhere below, the creek kept talking. She turned the page and started a new list. What happens next, she wrote at the top, is mine to decide. She started with the coins because the coins were the most legible to her. Not in the sense that she could read their value. She couldn't. But in the sense that she could hold them, turn them in her hands, feel their weight and the particular density of old metal, which was different from the coins she used every day in a way she couldn't have articulated before she held them, but which was immediately obvious once she did. New money felt light. These felt like they meant it. She opened the mason jars one at a time, beginning at the left end of the first shelf, working her way methodically to the right in the order her grandmother had arranged them. The coins inside each jar were not loose. They were sleeved, each one in its own small plastic holder, stacked in columns within the jar with the care of someone who understood that contact and friction were enemies of preservation. She lifted the first one and held it to the bare bulb's light, and looked at the profile of a woman she didn't recognize on a field that had darkened with age to the deep, warm brown of old leather. She photographed each jar. She photographed individual coins from the one she opened, working with the patience she'd been rebuilding in herself over the past 3 months, the patience that unemployment and rejection and sleeping on someone else's couch had stripped away and which she was now reconstructing, piece by piece, from what was available. Her phone battery ran low at the end of the second day in the cellar. She drove 20 minutes to a gas station to charge it, sitting in the parking lot for 40 minutes watching truckers come and go, her notepad in her lap, adding to her inventory while the phone charged from the car's outlet. She felt slightly absurd and completely focused, which was a combination she'd forgotten was possible. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. By the end of the third day, she had photographed everything on the shelves that was visible and labeled and identifiable from the outside of its housing. The coin jars, the stamp trays, the flat boxes she was now fairly certain contained prints. She had not yet opened the wooden crates in the corner. She was saving those, not out of cowardice, but out of order, because the crates were the thing Elsa had chosen not to label, and they deserved to be reached when she was ready for them. When she'd established a baseline for everything else, and could receive the unknown from a position of some knowledge rather than none. What she needed now was knowledge. Real knowledge, the kind that required someone who had spent years or decades learning what she was looking at. She needed an appraiser. More than one, probably, since she was dealing with at least 3 distinct categories of objects. She had a coin collection, or something that presented like one. She had a stamp collection, or something that presented like one. She had works on paper of unknown origin and provenance. She had 6 sealed crates of unknown contents. She had the entire contents of a room her grandmother had maintained in secret for what appeared, based on the oldest dated items she could identify, to be at least 40 years. She sat at the kitchen table in the cabin that evening writing the list of things she didn't know, which was longer than the list of things she did, and tried to think clearly about the order of operations. The order of operations mattered. She'd learned this from the most painful classroom available, the classroom of having trusted the wrong person to manage the order of operations for 11 years while she paid attention to other things. Now she was paying attention. She could not simply call an appraiser from an internet search and invite them to a remote cabin in the Virginia mountains to look at items of unknown value. That was not a sequence of events that ended well for her. She needed to understand what she had well enough to choose the right expert for the job, and she needed to do that without broadcasting what she'd found to anyone who might have an interest in it. Marcus came into her mind without invitation, as he tended to do. She pushed him back out with the same firmness she'd been applying to him all week, the firmness of a woman who had decided that the amount of mental real estate she allocated to her ex-husband was going to be a budget line she controlled going forward. She started online. The gas station she'd charged her phone at had decent signal, and she sat in the parking lot again with a cup of coffee from inside that tasted like it had been brewed before the current administration and worked through coin grading resources for 3 hours. She learned what she needed to learn. That the Morgan silver dollars Elsa had labeled in her mason jars were among the most widely collected American coins, that their value varied enormously based on year, mint mark, and condition, that the best preserved specimens in certain key dates were worth thousands of dollars each. She learned that the term barber referred to coins designed by Charles E. Barber, the chief engraver of the United States Mint from 1879 to 1917, and that the Barber quarters and dimes and half dollars from the 1890s and early 1900s that Elsa had cataloged were exactly the kind of coins that serious collectors spent decades pursuing. She sat with this information for a long moment in the gas station parking lot, while an 18-wheeler idled 30 feet away, and a teenager held the door open for his grandmother, and the particular ordinary world of a Tuesday afternoon in rural Virginia continued around her, without any knowledge of what was sitting in a cellar 12 miles away. Then she learned something else. She learned that the numismatic world, the world of serious coin collecting and dealing, had a specific geography, that there were major auction houses that handled collections of consequence, that there were regional dealers with established reputations who could provide preliminary assessments, and that there was a protocol for this kind of thing, a correct sequence that protected the seller as much as the buyer if you followed it carefully and didn't let impatience or desperation make your decisions for you. She was not going to let impatience or desperation make her decisions. She had already made that mistake, and it had cost her a house and a car in 11 years, and she was not going to make it again. She drove back to the cabin. She called Darla that night from the porch, wrapped in her grandmother's wool coat she'd found in the cedar chest in the bedroom, standing in the cold with her breath making small clouds in the dark. She'd been wanting to call Darla for 3 days. She'd been holding off because talking about it made it real in a way she wasn't sure she could manage yet, and because Darla had opinions the way some people had reflexes, immediately, and without deliberate engagement. Darla answered on the second ring with the tone of someone who'd been waiting. "You found something," Darla said. "Not a question. What makes you say that?" "Because you haven't called in 3 days, and when you don't call it means you're thinking too hard about something to talk to anyone. Also, Priya has been asking where you are every 6 hours. What did you find?" Nora leaned against the porch railing, feeling its resistance, testing it out of habit now. "I found a cellar under the bedroom floor." "A cellar? With things in it?" "Things." Darla's voice changed tone the way a car changed gears, smooth and deliberate. "What kind of things?" The kind my grandmother kept there for what looks like 40 years without telling anyone. A pause. The kind that meant Darla was recalibrating. Nora, are you telling me your grandmother hid things in a cellar? I'm telling you I found a cellar with things in it that looked deliberate and old and carefully maintained. I don't know what they're worth yet. I don't know exactly what some of them are yet. I'm being careful. You're being careful, Darla repeated slowly. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched a friend be too trusting for too long and was reconsidering their assumptions. Good. Don't tell anyone else. I'm not telling anyone else. Does Marcus know you found anything? Marcus doesn't know I exist right now, which is exactly how I want it. Okay. Darla's voice settled into the register she used when she was making decisions. You need an expert. More than one, probably. I know someone, Darla said. She said it with the ease of a woman who always knew someone, which was one of the things about Darla that was sometimes overwhelming and frequently useful. His name is Gerald Whitmore. He's retired now, but he used to work at Christie's. Authentication and valuation, estate collections mostly. He moved back to Pennsylvania 3 years ago. He's particular and he charges for consultations, but he's the real thing. How do you know him? He's Priya's godfather's college roommate. I know everyone eventually. You want his number? Yes, Nora said. And Darla, don't tell anyone why I'm asking. Darla was quiet for a moment. Marcus really did a number on you. He taught me to be careful about assets, Nora said. I'm applying the lesson. She heard Darla's small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh, and then the scratch of pen on paper. She had Gerald Whitmore's number by the time she went inside. She didn't call it for 2 more days. Those 2 days she spent with the wooden crates. She'd been putting them off with the logic of order, but she knew herself well enough to admit there was something else underneath the logic, a version of the feeling she'd had standing at the top of the cellar stairs before she climbed down, the sensation of a threshold you couldn't uncross. Once she knew what was in the crates, she would have to reckon with it, one way or another. Until she knew, it was still possibility, still the open space of maybe, and maybe was a thing she was still learning to tolerate after years of certainties that had turned out to be hollow. She opened the first crate on the 4th morning in the cabin, early, before the light fully came up, with a cup of tea made from a tin of loose leaves she'd found in the kitchen cabinet, and a fire already built in the stone fireplace above. She brought the crate up from the cellar and set it on the kitchen table because the kitchen table was solid and wide, and because she needed to do this in the light of the main room, with the fire and the view through the window and all the ordinary steadiness of the cabin around her. The crate was wooden, pine, built simply, its lid secured with 4 flathead screws she removed with a screwdriver from the small toolkit in her car. The lid came off cleanly. Inside, packed in what appeared to be acid-free tissue paper that had yellowed slightly with age but maintained its function, were more coins. Not in mason jars this time. These were in individual hard plastic cases, the kind she'd seen in her online research, the kind used by professional graders. Each case had a label with numbers and letters she could now partially read, the coin type, the date, the grade. She picked up the first one and tilted it toward the window. The coin inside was gold. She knew it immediately, the color unmistakable, not the brassy yellow of gold-tone finish, but the particular warm, deep, dense yellow of actual gold. The color that explained why people had organized entire economies around this metal for thousands of years. The coin was larger than a quarter, its surfaces showing a woman with a torch raised above her head on one face and an eagle with spread wings on the other. She turned it carefully in its case, reading the label. St. Gaudens Double Eagle, 1908, MS, 65. She set it down on the table and stood back. She needed to look up what MS, 65 meant. She already knew from her research what a St. Gaudens Double Eagle was. It was the $20 gold piece designed by sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens at the request of Theodore Roosevelt, widely considered the most beautiful coin ever minted in the United States. She pulled up the gas station internet on her phone from memory, navigating to a numismatic grading guide with her fingers that had started to shake slightly. MS 65 was a mint state grade, gem uncirculated, one of the highest grades a coin could receive. The coin she was holding in its plastic case had never been used as currency. It had been preserved at or near its original mint state. She found a price guide. She set the phone down. Then she opened the rest of the crate. There were 42 coins in the first crate, each one graded, each one labeled, each one in its own sealed case. They were not all gold. There were silver dollars, Morgan and peace types, graded at levels she was now beginning to understand represented the upper range of what collectors considered collectible. There were early American coins, bust dollars and capped bust halves, their dates ranging from the 1790s to the 1830s, coins that were not merely old, but historically significant, coins that had existed before there was a Federal Reserve System or a standardized banking infrastructure, coins that had changed hands in a country still learning what it was. She sat at the table for a long time with the crates open around her and the fire burning and the thin winter light coming through the window, and she did not feel the exhilaration she might have expected. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated than exhilaration. She felt the specific weight of inheritance understood correctly, the weight of someone else's lifetime of patience and care and quiet determination made material and left in her hands. She felt the responsibility of it more immediately than she felt the joy, though the joy was there underneath, slow and real and building like the fire in the stone hearth. She called Gerald Whitmore that afternoon. He answered on the fourth ring with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned decades ago that urgency and accuracy were rarely available at the same time and had made his choice accordingly. She explained herself carefully. She had inherited a property in Virginia. She had found a collection of items in the property that she believed might be significant. She was seeking a professional assessment from someone with estate collection experience and the ability to treat the matter with discretion. He asked 3 questions. What categories of items were involved, how she had come to own the property, and whether she was in a position to wait 4 weeks for his earliest available appointment. She told him coins and stamps and works on paper of unknown origin. She told him the property had been her grandmother's. She told him 4 weeks was fine, she would wait. He gave her a date and a fee for the preliminary consultation and a set of guidelines for how to preserve and handle the items in the interim that confirmed, in their specificity and their precision, that she had found the right person. She called Darla back that evening. I called him, she said, and he'll come in 4 weeks. He's particular, you were right about that. What did you tell him? Only what I needed to. He's coming to the cabin in Virginia. I'm staying here until then. Darla was quiet for a moment. You're staying at the cabin. Nora, it's November. That place is barely insulated. It's insulated enough. You're going to freeze yourself in a mountain cabin for a month waiting for an appraiser. I'm going to prepare what I have for an appraiser, Nora corrected. In a place that belongs to me. Where the water works, and the fire burns, and the view from the porch is something I didn't know still existed in the world I currently live in. Another pause. Darla's pauses were as communicative as most people's sentences. This one said, I think you are going to be all right, and I am slightly surprised by this, and I am more grateful than I will say out loud. I'll send warmer blankets, Darla said. And Priya wants to know if there are animals in the woods. Probably several kinds. She'll be thrilled. Darla's voice shifted into its practical gear. How are you for food? I'm managing. And Darla, I still need you to not tell anyone about this. I haven't told anyone. But I want you to know that I find not telling anyone very difficult, and I'm doing it as an act of friendship. I know. Thank you. She was learning things about the cabin in the same slow way she was learning things about the collection, methodically, one category at a time, adding to the inventory of her knowledge the way she'd been adding to the written inventory of what was here. She learned that the roof needed exactly one section of shingles replaced, at the front left corner where the moss had finally won its long argument with the underlying material. She learned that the well was deep and clean, tested at the county health office on a drive to town for supplies. The results returned by email showing water quality that met all relevant standards. She learned that the septic system existed and was functional, a buried concrete tank on the downhill side of the property that a local inspector confirmed was sound when she called him from her car outside the hardware store in town. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She learned that the cabin had a wood stove in the bedroom that she hadn't noticed the first day because it was behind the door when it opened and she'd been focused on the floor. The wood stove changed things. It meant the bedroom was habitable at night, not merely endurable, and she shifted her sleeping there, on the iron bed frame with the mattress she'd bought from a thrift store in town for $30 and hauled up the mountain road in the Honda's back seat, folded in half and tied with a bungee cord. She slept better with the stove. She slept with the particular depth of a person who had worked hard with their hands during the day and whose body demanded the accounting. She was working hard, not only with the documentation, which continued systematically through the 4 weeks of waiting, but with the cabin itself. She replaced the porch boards herself, buying the lumber from a hardware store outside town and cutting it to length in the drive with a circular saw she found in the small outbuilding behind the cabin, a structure she'd initially assumed was a shed for garden tools and which turned out also to contain a workbench, a collection of hand tools maintained with the same care as everything else Elsa had left, and a set of property surveys that told her, for the first time, the exact dimensions of what she owned. The parcel was larger than the cabin suggested. The survey showed 4.5 acres in total, the cabin and its cleared area representing less than a quarter of the land, the rest being wooded hillside dropping toward the creek at the bottom and rising to a ridge at the back. The property line ran along the ridge, and at the far corner of the survey, marked with a note in Elsa's handwriting added to the margin of an official document in pencil, she found a notation she didn't immediately understand. Secondary structure. Rear parcel. Survey mark R7. She didn't go looking for survey mark R7 immediately. She filed it under things to investigate and went back to the cabin because Gerald Whitmore was coming in 2 weeks and she needed the documentation to be complete. She finished the stamp inventory on the 9th day. 14 trays, each one containing multiple rows of stamps and protective sleeves, each one labeled with Elsa's handwriting identifying periods and types she had now done enough research to partially recognize. There were issues from the first American stamps, the 1847 5-cent and 10-cent stamps that had been the first official postage stamps printed in the United States, and which she had learned from her research were among the most aggressively collected American philatelic items. There were Confederate States stamps from the Civil War period. There were airmail stamps from the early aviation era, the 1918 Curtiss Jenny Invert, whose name she'd looked up in a state of disbelief when she first saw it on Elsa's label, only to find that a single example of this stamp, in which the biplane in the center was printed upside down, had sold at auction for over $1 million. She'd sat with that fact for a full day before she could think about it clearly. The works on paper in the flat boxes she'd opened carefully over several sessions, each box revealing more of what she was now beginning to think of as Elsa's extended argument with obscurity, her grandmother's private collection of the overlooked and the undervalued. There were etchings and lithographs and engravings, some of them signed in the plates, some of them signed by hand in pencil in the lower margin in the way that printmakers of the 19th and early 20th centuries had authenticated their work. She photographed each one and spent evenings in the gas station parking lot cross-referencing signatures against databases of documented artists, finding some names she recognized from art history courses she'd taken 20 years ago and others she couldn't place at all, which didn't mean they were without value, only that her knowledge was insufficient. She opened the remaining wooden crates across the 2nd and 3rd weeks of her waiting. The 2nd crate held more graded coins, silver and gold, adding to the volume of the first. The 3rd crate was different. It held pocket watches. 6 of them, each in its own padded case, each one a different maker, each one antique in the way of things made before mass production made craft unnecessary. She knew almost nothing about antique watches, which meant another research session in the gas station parking lot, which confirmed what she'd suspected from the quality of the cases and the care of the storage. These were not costume pieces. They were instruments, mechanical work from the era when watchmaking was a discipline that demanded the same precision as surgery and was valued accordingly. The 4th crate held something she hadn't expected. Silver. Not coins this time. Objects. A set of silver flatware in a fitted wooden case, each piece wrapped in flannel cloth that had prevented the tarnishing that would otherwise have accumulated over decades. A tea service, pot, creamer, sugar bowl, tray, all hallmarked. The marks on the base of each piece telling a story she needed a silversmith or a silver specialist to fully read. A small silver box with an engraved surface, its clasp working smoothly despite its age. A pair of candlesticks, tall and formal, with the weight of silver that is silver all the way through rather than plated over base metal. She held the teapot and turned it and looked at the hallmarks, a lion passant, a date letter, a city mark. She'd looked up enough to know this meant English sterling. She'd looked up enough to know that English sterling tea services of the Georgian and Victorian periods, in complete sets and good condition, were exactly the kind of thing that appeared at auction in the major houses and drew serious money from serious collectors. The fifth crate held paper. Not prints this time, but documents, letters, deeds, certificates, a bundle of items that looked at first glance like the administrative residue of an ordinary life, and which, on closer examination, were not that at all. There were letters with letterheads she recognized after enough looking. Established firms from the early and mid-20th century, correspondence from auction houses, receipts for purchases and sales, records of what appeared to be a lifetime of quiet, strategic acquisition. Her grandmother had not merely kept these things. She had bought some of them deliberately, across decades, from dealers and at auctions and through private sales. The documentation was in Elsa's files with the same orderly care she brought to everything. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had understood something about value that most people never learned, or learned too late. That scarcity and age and quality converged in objects the way they rarely did in other investments, and that a person of modest means who spent 40 years acquiring carefully, buying what was undervalued and holding it patiently without telling anyone, could assemble something extraordinary from what looked from the outside like nothing at all. Elsa had attended estate sales in her region for decades. She'd corresponded with dealers. She'd built her knowledge the same way she'd built her collection, one piece at a time, without fanfare, without external validation, without anyone to tell her she was doing something worth doing. She had simply done it. The sixth crate Nora opened on the Sunday before Gerald Whitmore's appointment. She'd saved it deliberately, some instinct telling her it was different from the others, because it was the one Elsa had placed at the very back of the room, against the far wall, under the only section of shelving that was empty. As if it were separate from the collection. As if it belonged to a different category entirely. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and then in layers of acid-free tissue, and then in a box within the box, was a book. Not a printed book. A manuscript. Hand-lettered. In an ink that had browned with age. On paper that was heavy and cream-colored, and carried its years with the authority of things that had survived more than most. The cover was plain, no title embossed, no decoration. Only the leather itself, smooth and dark with handling over what must have been many generations of hands. She opened it with the gentleness she'd been practicing on everything down here and read the first line. She could not read the language. She recognized the script as something European, but could not place the period or the origin. What she could read was the date on the first page, written in numerals rather than words in the way that dates often were in old documents. 1521. She closed the book carefully, replaced it in its wrappings, and sat back against the cellar wall. 1521. That was 6 years after Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door at Wittenberg. That was 29 years after Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean. That was the year Hernán Cortés completed his conquest of the Aztec Empire, and Magellan died in the Philippines on the first circumnavigation of the globe. The world in 1521 was a world in the process of becoming unrecognizable to itself, a world being redrawn by discovery and conflict and the violent redistribution of certainties. And somewhere in that world, someone had sat down and written this book in this hand in this ink on this paper, and it had survived, through 5 centuries of everything that happened, to the cellar of a mountain cabin in Virginia, where a woman named Elsa Patton had placed it under the empty shelf at the back of the room, as if even she, the most deliberate person Nora had ever known, didn't entirely know what to do with it. She stayed in the cellar a long time that evening, not working, not cataloging, just sitting in the yellow light with the manuscript and its wrappings beside her and the inventory on her notepad spread across the workbench. She was reading through what she'd documented over the past 3 weeks, not to check it for errors, but to let herself receive it completely, the full scope of it, the full weight of what had been waiting here. $47, she thought. That was what she'd had when she signed the divorce papers. That was the number Marcus's attorneys had left her with. That was the residue of 11 years of believing in someone who had categorized her as an asset until she wasn't performing and then had handled her exit with the same efficiency he brought to everything. He'd missed this. In his thoroughness, in his absolute confidence that he had accounted for everything worth accounting for, he had looked at a $1 assessment and moved on. He had missed 40 years of her grandmother's patience. He had missed a cellar in a mountain hillside in Virginia. He had missed because he had never understood what kind of woman Nora came from. The specific gravity of the word inheritance when the person leaving the inheritance had spent a lifetime making it mean something. She went upstairs and made tea and sat on the porch in the dark wrapped in Elsa's wool coat and listened to the creek in the valley below. The sky was clear, the stars sharper at this elevation than she was used to. The Milky Way a sweep of light across the southern sky that she used to see as a child and had not seen since she'd moved to cities where the light drowned everything fainter than direct. She thought about what it would mean. Not what it would be worth, not yet, because worth was a number and she needed experts to give her numbers, and she would have them in 5 days. What it would mean was a different question, one she could work on herself without any expertise required. She thought about the apartment she'd been trying to save for and the job applications that hadn't returned her calls and the couch in Darla's living room and Priya's plastic toys underfoot in the dark and the $47 and the borrowed Honda and all of it, the whole topography of the life she was currently living. She thought about what it felt like to be at the bottom of something and to look up and not see any clear path to the top. And then she thought about Elsa, who had grown up with nothing, who had worked at a library for 30 years, who had driven the same car for 21 years and worn her shoes until they wore through and spent 40 years building something in the quiet and the dark that nobody knew about except herself, and who had left it to Nora without a note of explanation because the explanation was not necessary. The explanation was this: I saw what you came from. I saw what you were capable of. I built this for you in the years before you needed it, and now you need it, and here it is. The tea went cold. The fire in the cabin behind her ticked quietly as it settled into coals. The stars moved in their familiar and indifferent patterns across the November sky. In 5 days, Gerald Whitmore was coming. He would look at what was in the cellar and he would tell her, with the authority of decades and the precision of a man who had spent his career at the intersection of art and money, what she actually had. He would give her the numbers. She was not prepared for what the numbers were going to be. She understood this in the way you understood something before it became knowledge, in the way the body understood things before the mind caught up. She had been spending 3 weeks with these objects, learning their categories, reading their histories, holding them in the careful hands of someone who was trying to understand rather than to possess, and the conclusion she was moving toward, slowly and with all the caution she could muster, was that the life-changing thing she'd been hoping for without daring to name it was not a metaphor. It was a room full of evidence. She went back inside and climbed under her grandmother's blankets in the iron bed with the wood stove ticking warmth into the small bedroom and listened to the mountains settling around her and thought about Elsa's handwriting on those mason jar lids. Small, precise, slightly slanted. The handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship as a discipline rather than a preference. The handwriting of a woman who had never done anything without purpose. Sleep came slowly, but it came. In 4 days, Gerald Whitmore called to confirm his appointment. He had a habit, he explained without apology, of confirming the day before with any client he was traveling to see, simply to ensure that circumstances had not changed. His voice carried the particular quality of someone who had learned early that clarity prevented complications, and who preferred prevention to remedy. Everything is as we discussed, Nora told him. Good, he said. I'll be there at 10. She spent the day before his arrival organizing the cellar. Not cleaning, not staging, not making it look different from what it was, only ensuring that the inventory she'd written was complete and that each item was accessible without requiring him to move other items to reach it. Professionals, she had learned in her working years, did their best work when the subject was clearly presented. She owed it to Elsa to have this presented correctly. She also spent part of that day climbing to the rear of the property. She'd been thinking about the survey notation since she found it. Secondary structure. Rear parcel. Survey mark R7. She'd been putting it off for 3 weeks in the way you put off something that might change your understanding of a situation you were still assembling. But the evening before Gerald Whitmore's arrival felt like the right time, while there was still enough of the afternoon light left to navigate the wooded hillside at the back of the property. She found the survey marker, a metal pin driven into the ground at the edge of a natural clearing in the trees, about 300 yards from the cabin. The clearing was irregular, shaped by the trees around it rather than by any human design, and at its center, almost invisible under 20 years of encroaching brush and vine, was a structure. Not a shed, not a lean-to, not anything as casual as that. A building. Small, perhaps 12 feet by 15, built from the same dressed stone as the cabin's foundation, with a door that was still plumb in its frame after however many years it had been standing here without being opened. The door was locked with a padlock, heavy iron, different from the lock on the cabin's front door, and older, and secured with the kind of deliberateness that suggested it had not been placed there casually. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the building in the fading afternoon light, and felt the sensation she'd been feeling all month in various intensities, the sensation of a door not yet opened, of a question not yet answered, of Elsa's lifetime of purpose not yet fully disclosed. There was a key for it. She was sure of that much. Everything Elsa had left had been designed to be found and opened and used by whoever came here with the right combination of need and attention and patience. There would be a key somewhere. In the cabin, in the cellar, in the cedar chest or the cabinet or somewhere she hadn't thought to look. She went back down to the cabin. She had a dinner to make and a fire to build and an appraiser coming in the morning, and the stone building in the clearing at the back of the property would wait. It had been waiting for 20 years or more without her. It could wait one more night. She cooked on the cast iron stove, a simple meal of the kind she'd been cooking all month, the kind that required nothing except attention and heat and the willingness to be patient with things that needed time. She ate at the wooden table with the fire going and Rose's journal in front of her. Except it wasn't Rose's journal. It was Elsa's. It was her grandmother's estate files spread across the table, the letters and receipts and correspondence that told the story of 40 years of careful work. She read until her eyes were tired, and then she went to bed. She woke at 5:14 in the morning, earlier than intended, the wood stove down to embers, and the bedroom cold and dark. She lay still for a moment, uncertain what had woken her. No wind, no animal sound, just the particular silence of the mountain before dawn, which was a different silence than the silence of any time of day, deeper and more complete, the silence of a world that had not yet reminded itself to move. And then she knew what had woken her. She had remembered where to find the key. She got up in the dark and pulled on her grandmother's coat and walked through the cold cabin to the kitchen area and reached into the back of the cabinet with the cast iron, the one that held the skillet and the Dutch oven and the long-handled ladle. She reached past the ladle and past the stack of pot lids and felt along the back wall of the cabinet where the wood met the interior corner, and her fingers found it. A nail. And on the nail, a key. She stood in the kitchen holding the key in the cold dark before dawn, the fire out and the mountain silent around her, and the cellar below the bedroom floor full of her grandmother's decades of work, and felt with absolute certainty that she was not done finding things. That what was in the stone building at the back of the property was another room in the conversation Elsa had been having with the future for 40 years. Another part of what she'd been building and maintaining and protecting. Gerald Whitmore was coming in 5 hours. She put the key on the table where she would see it, where she would remember to take it when the time was right, and built up the fire and put the kettle on and stood at the window watching the dark begin its slow negotiation with the dawn. The mountains came back first. The far ridgeline against the slightly lighter sky, a distinction so subtle she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching carefully. Then the valley, the creek appearing as a silver thread at the bottom of the hill. Then the near trees, their bare branches resolving out of the gray like handwriting appearing on a page. She watched the day arrive and thought about what it meant to come from a woman like Elsa. To inherit not only what she'd built, but the understanding of how she'd built it. To learn, through the simple act of sitting with someone's legacy long enough to read it clearly, how a life was supposed to be conducted. Quietly, with purpose, without asking for permission or recognition or the validation of anyone who couldn't see what you were building because they'd already decided it wasn't there. The kettle began to whistle. She poured her tea and carried it to the porch and stood in the cold morning air, watching the valley fully come back to itself, watching the world remember its shape. The key was in her coat pocket. The cellar was ready. Gerald Whitmore was coming. She thought about Marcus and his attorneys and the $47 and the laughing. She thought about it without anger, which surprised her. The anger had been real and it had been warranted, and she'd carried it for months like the weight of something she'd been handed without asking. And somewhere in the past 3 weeks, in the cellar and the cold, and the slow work of understanding what she'd found, she'd set it down. Not because Marcus deserved her grace, only because she needed the room it had been taking up. She needed that room for what came next. The sun cleared the eastern ridge at 7:42. She watched it arrive and felt its thin November warmth on her face and thought about Elsa coming out here on mornings like this one, standing where she was standing, looking at what she was looking at. The same creek, the same mountains, the same bare trees making their complicated patterns against the same sky. Thinking, as she said, thinking. At 9:53, a dark green sedan came slowly up the gravel drive and stopped in front of the cabin. Gerald Whitmore got out. He was older than she'd imagined from his voice, mid-70s, with the lean, careful posture of a man who had learned that attention was a physical practice. He wore a coat that was built for function rather than impression and carried a leather case that had clearly been used for the purpose it was carrying for a very long time. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the view. He looked at Nora. "Your grandmother chose well," he said. "She did," Nora agreed. "She chose everything well." She led him inside. She led him to the bedroom. She lifted the trapdoor. She held it open and gestured toward the steps below, and Gerald Whitmore looked down into the cellar that Elsa Patton had spent 40 years building in secret, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened his leather case and took out a pair of cotton gloves. "Let's start at the beginning," he said. They went down together. Gerald Whitmore did not speak for the first 14 minutes. Nora had timed it without meaning to, the way she'd been timing and counting everything since arriving at the cabin, the inventory habit extending itself now into seconds rather than shelves. He moved through the cellar with the unhurried deliberateness of a man for whom rushed conclusions were a professional insult, touching nothing until he had looked at it, looking at nothing until he had established its context. He began at the left wall with the mason jars of coins and moved right, pausing at each section, bending occasionally to examine something more closely, straightening, moving on. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, entirely neutral, the voice of a professional who had learned to defer his reactions until he had enough information to make them honest. "Your grandmother was a collector." A pause. He turned to look at Nora with an expression she couldn't read. Not a collector in the hobbyist sense. A collector in the informed, systematic sense. This is not accumulated over a weekend or from a single source. This represents decades of considered acquisition. I know. Nora had found the estate correspondence by then, the letters from dealers and the receipts from auctions. I found her purchase records. She started in the early 1960s, as far back as I can document. It goes on for 40 years. Gerald turned back to the shelves. His hand hovered near the first mason jar without touching it, a gesture that was more about indicating than examining. Coins, stamps, works on paper, silver, timepieces. She diversified. That is either instinct or knowledge, and based on the condition of what I'm seeing, I'm inclined toward knowledge. She worked at a library for 30 years. He turned again, looked at her with the same unreadable expression. Then the small corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was its near neighbor. A librarian. Of course she was. He spent 3 hours in the cellar that morning. He did not appraise anything. He was careful to be clear about that distinction, careful to repeat it when Nora pressed. He was not here to give her numbers today. He was here to assess what categories they were dealing with and what the appropriate next steps were. Numbers required more time, more tools, more specialists for certain items. What he could give her today was an informed preliminary opinion and a direction forward. They came back upstairs at 1 in the afternoon and sat at the wooden table with the fire going and cups of tea she'd made while he was writing in his notebook. He had filled 6 pages. He set the notebook on the table between them and looked at her with the directness of someone who'd decided to dispense with preamble. "I want to ask you something first," he said. "Go ahead. Are you in a financially difficult position right now?" She met his eyes. "Yes." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already understood. "Do you have any immediate debts or time-sensitive obligations that might affect how you approach this?" She told him. The $47. The divorce. The couch she'd been sleeping on. She said it plainly and without self-pity because self-pity was not a posture that produced useful outcomes, and also because Gerald Whitmore seemed like a man who would take plain truth more seriously than decorated versions of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his tea. Then he said, I want you to understand that what I tell you now is preliminary. It is not a formal valuation, and individual items could vary significantly in either direction depending on authentication processes that take time. Do you understand that? Yes. He opened his notebook. The coins, he began, represent the most immediately quantifiable portion of what you have down there. The graded specimens in the sealed cases are already authenticated. Their grades are documented by established third-party services, and those grades carry market weight. Based on what I saw this morning, and I want to be clear that I am an estate specialist with generalist expertise, not a numismatic specialist, I would estimate the graded coin collection alone is in the range of $400,000 to $600,000 at current market. That estimate accounts for the gold pieces, the early American coinage, and the high-grade Morgan and Peace dollars. A numismatic specialist could put you at the higher end or beyond it. I would not be surprised. Nora set her mug down very carefully. The stamps, he continued, in the same steady voice he might have used to read a weather report, require a philatelic specialist. I am not qualified to estimate the stamps with confidence. What I can tell you is that based on the periods represented and the conditions I observed, this is not an amateur collection. If what I think I'm seeing in those trays is accurate, the stamp collection could represent a value equal to or exceeding the coins, possibly significantly exceeding. The items I believe to be from the 1840s and 1850s alone could be of substantial individual value. He turned a page in his notebook. The works on paper require an art historian with period expertise. The silver requires a silversmith and a specialist in English hallmarks. The timepieces require a horologist. What I can tell you is that the condition of all these items, as a result of the storage environment your grandmother created, is exceptional. That environmental stability over decades is itself a form of value added, because condition is everything in collectibles, and your grandmother understood that. He closed the notebook. There is one other matter. The manuscript, Nora said. He looked at her steadily. The manuscript. Yes. I want to be very careful in what I say about that because manuscripts of potential age and significance are a field requiring very specific expertise and a great deal of careful authentication. What I will say is that if the date is accurate, and if the document is genuine, which those are two substantial conditional clauses that need to be resolved before any conclusions can be drawn, then you are looking at something that belongs in a museum or a rare books auction rather than in a preliminary estate valuation. The last significant illuminated manuscript from that period to go to auction cleared $8 million. A secular document of genuine provenance could range enormously. I would not speculate on a number. He let that settle. I will tell you, he said after a moment, that I have been doing this work for 41 years. I have assessed collections of all sizes for estates ranging from the modest to the very significant. What is in the cellar under this cabin is not modest. It is at the higher end of what I have seen in private estates, and it appears to have been assembled by a woman of remarkable intelligence and discipline who understood that real value accrues slowly and quietly and without an audience. Nora looked at the fire. She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her breathing steady with the specific effort of someone managing a physical response that threatened to become overwhelming. What do I do now? She asked. You take your time, Gerald said, which I understand is easier advice to give than to follow when you are in a financially difficult position. But I want to say it clearly. Taking your time is the single most important thing you can do. The value of what you have does not diminish if you proceed carefully. It can diminish if you proceed carelessly. Get each category assessed by the appropriate specialist. Build documentation for the provenance. Do not discuss this with anyone who does not have a direct professional need to know. And if anyone contacts you seeking to acquire the collection before it is fully assessed and documented, decline. He said the last sentence with the particular emphasis of a man who had seen what happened when people didn't follow that advice. I'll get you a list of specialists, he said. People I trust, people who have worked with me before and who understand what discretion means in this context. Start with the coins, they're the most straightforward. Let that process run while the other assessments are being arranged. It will take months to do this properly. Plan for months. She nodded. He stood, put on his coat, picked up his leather case. At the door he paused and looked back at her. Your grandmother, he said. Did she know you would need this? Nora thought about the property transfer dated the year of her marriage. About the 11 years Elsa had lived after that transfer. The 11 years during which she had said nothing, maintained the property, kept the cellar, driven the same car for 21 years. She thought about the key on the nail in the back of the cabinet. I think, Nora said slowly, that she was paying attention to how things were going, and she trusted that I'd eventually be ready to find it. Gerald nodded once, the compact nod of a man who found that answer sufficient. Call me when you've worked through the coin assessment, he said. We'll talk about next steps. She walked him to his car and watched the dark green sedan move carefully back down the gravel drive and disappear into the trees. She stood in the driveway in the November cold for a long time after the sound of the engine faded, letting the mountain settle back into its usual quiet. The creek ran in the valley. The bare trees stood in the thin sun. The stone chimney stood against the pale sky. $400,000 to $600,000. For the coins alone. She went inside and put another log on the fire and sat at the table and looked at the key she'd placed there in the morning, the key to the stone building at the back of the property. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers and thought about Elsa, who had built this over 40 years in the most deliberate silence, who had never once suggested to any member of her family that there was anything here worth coming to find. She'd driven the same car for 21 years. She'd been building this. Nora stood up, put on her coat, and walked out the back door and up the hill toward the trees, toward the rear parcel, toward whatever came next. The key was warm in her hand from the fire and from her fingers holding it. The mountain was cold and still and holding its secrets the way it always had, the way Elsa had taught it to, with patience and without apology. She climbed toward the stone building in the clearing. The afternoon light was already beginning to angle toward the western ridge. There were maybe 2 hours of daylight left. It would be enough. The key fit the padlock perfectly, which should not have surprised her, and did anyway. The way small confirmations continued to surprise her in this place, where everything her grandmother had done turned out to be exactly as intended. The lock opened with a clean snap, the mechanism smooth and unresisting, recently oiled like the hinges on the trapdoor, maintained by someone who understood that a door locked was only useful if a door could also be opened. Nora removed the padlock and held it in her hand for a moment, feeling its weight, then set it on the ground beside the door. The afternoon light was coming through the trees at a low angle now, the kind of light that made everything it touched look considered, intentional, as if the world had arranged itself specifically for this moment. She knew that was not the case. She pushed the thought aside and put her hand on the door. She stood there for just a breath. Not from fear. From the habit she'd been building all month, the habit of not rushing through thresholds she couldn't uncross. Then she pulled the door open and stepped inside. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The building was dark until she found the switch just inside the door, a simple toggle switch mounted to the stone wall. The light that came on was different from the bare bulb in the cellar. It was warm and even, the kind of lighting that came from strips hidden behind wooden valances along the top of the walls, indirect and diffuse, the kind specifically chosen to illuminate objects without damaging them. Someone had installed it with purpose. She had stopped being surprised that everything down here was installed with purpose, but she felt it anyway, that small shock of recognition each time Elsa's intelligence made itself visible. The building was one room, like the cabin above, but nothing like the cabin in any other respect. The walls were lined not with shelving, but with a thick layer of insulation boards faced with a pale material she recognized from her research as the kind of surface used in archival storage rooms, vapor-resistant and non-reactive. The floor was sealed concrete rather than packed earth. A small dehumidifier sat in the far corner, its indicator light green, running. She crossed to it and checked the water reservoir. It had been recently emptied. By whom, she didn't know. She added it to the list of questions about this property that she was no longer attempting to close before she was ready. Along one wall, suspended from horizontal bars mounted at ceiling height, were canvases. Not rolled, not boxed, but hung carefully in a row, each one facing the wall, each one with a backing of acid-free board held in place by padded clips. She counted them without moving, 9. She moved to the nearest one and lifted it from its bar with both hands and turned it around. It was a painting, oil on canvas, roughly 18 inches by 24. its surface showing the particular quality of old paint that had fully cured and settled into the permanence that only time could create. The image was a landscape, a mountainous vista in the style of the American Hudson River School painters, the sky enormous and layered with light, the land below it rendered in meticulous detail. The colors were deep and clear. She looked at the lower right corner for a signature, found it there in thin brushstrokes, a name she didn't immediately recognize, though it had the look of a name she should. She set it down and took out her phone and typed the name into the search bar she'd been using for 3 weeks now. The connection was weak this far from the road, but workable. The results came back slowly, loading one at a time. The painter was not famous. The painter was, as far as the internet was concerned, a minor figure from the 1870s and 1880s who had studied under one of the founding members of the Hudson River School and had produced a body of work that remained largely in private collections or in regional museums. There were auction records. She found them on the third result, a specialist fine art auction database she'd bookmarked 3 weeks ago. The most recent sale of this painter's work at auction had been 4 years ago. A landscape of comparable size and period, in similar condition. The hammer price had been $280,000. She stood in the stone building holding her phone with a minor signature on a canvas leaning against the wall behind her, and she understood for the first time that she had not yet grasped the full scale of what her grandmother had done here. She had been approaching it from the bottom up, building her understanding piece by piece, which was the correct approach and the only approach she trusted, but it meant that each time she thought she could see the whole of it, there was more. There had always been more. Elsa had apparently operated her entire life on a scale that nobody standing next to her would have thought to look for. She checked the remaining 8 canvases. She did not rush. She gave each one the same attention, the same careful handling, the same search on her phone, standing in the quiet stone building while the afternoon light outside moved toward the ridge and the dehumidifier ran its quiet rhythm in the corner. Of the 9 paintings, she could find auction records or gallery records for 6 of them. The values ranged from $80,000 to $460,000 for a larger canvas that turned out to be by a painter who had recently been the subject of a museum retrospective in New York, a reassessment that had driven his market up substantially from the prices his work had commanded when Elsa presumably acquired it. 2 of the remaining 3 painters she couldn't identify at all from her phone searches, which meant either they were so obscure as to have no digital record or her searches were insufficient. The 9th canvas was unsigned entirely, which created its own set of possibilities, none of them small. She sat on the floor of the stone building with her back against the wall and her phone in her hands, and looked at the 9 paintings hanging from their bars and felt the full weight of it arrive at last, the weight she'd been carrying in pieces for 3 weeks and which had now assembled itself into a single coherent thing. Her grandmother had spent 40 years turning a librarian's salary into a collection that, assembled here in secret and preserved with extraordinary care, was something that belonged to the world of major auction houses and museum acquisitions. She had done it without telling anyone, without asking for anyone's validation or permission or investment. She had read, researched, corresponded with dealers, attended estate sales in her region, driven to fairs and auctions on her days off, and built knowledge the way she'd built everything else in her life, methodically, patiently, and completely alone. And she had left it here, for Nora, in a cabin nobody thought was worth $1. She found the journals on the back wall of the building, behind the paintings, in a wooden cabinet she'd overlooked when she first came in because the cabinet was the same pale material as the wall behind it, almost invisible. The cabinet held 6 composition notebooks, the standard black and white kind sold at every drugstore in America, arranged in chronological order according to the dates written on their covers in Elsa's precise handwriting. The first was dated 1963. The last was dated the year before Elsa died. She opened the first one. January 4th, 1963, Elsa had written. Attended the Pendleton estate sale in Moorfield. Purchased a set of coins from the administrator for $12, Morgan silver dollars, 6 of them, condition good. The administrator knew nothing about grading. I said nothing useful to disabuse him of his assessment. This felt dishonest, and then I decided it was not dishonest, only accurate. He set the price. I paid it. Nora read this twice. Then she sat with it for a moment, feeling Elsa's voice come through the ink the way her grandmother's voice had always operated, direct and a little dry, and entirely certain about the difference between honesty and obligation. She kept reading. The journals were not dramatic. They were not written for an audience or for posterity or for any purpose other than the one Elsa stated explicitly in the second entry. I need to keep records, or I will lose track of what I have and what I paid for it and what I believe it is worth. Records are how you know things over time. They are more reliable than memory and considerably cheaper than lawyers. 40 years of records. 40 years of purchases documented with the price paid, the seller's name, the condition assessment in Elsa's own terms, the date of acquisition, and a running notation she called my belief, which was her private estimate of what she thought an item was actually worth versus what she had paid. The gap between what she paid and what she believed was the engine of the entire collection, the fuel that had run it for 4 decades. Elsa had never bought anything at full market value. She had bought things that other people didn't know how to price correctly, and she had priced them correctly herself, quietly, and then she had waited. She was patient, Nora thought. She was so extraordinarily patient. She read until the light outside was gone, and she was reading by the artificial warmth of the valance lights. And then she closed the last journal and sat in the stone building for a while longer, not wanting to leave it yet, not wanting to break the feeling of being inside Elsa's thinking place in the most complete sense, surrounded by 40 years of thought, made physical and particular and real. She locked the building and went back down to the cabin and built up the fire and made dinner and went to bed. She slept without waking until dawn. The months that followed moved at the pace that Gerald Whitmore had promised, steady, careful, and longer than impatience could easily accommodate. She called Darla in early December and told her the full scope of what she'd found, the cellar and the building and the journals, the coins and the stamps and the manuscript and the paintings, the numbers Gerald had given her and the numbers she'd found on her own. She recounted it in the same flat, organized way she'd been training herself to discuss it, without escalation, without drama, because drama invited reactions she didn't have the resources to manage. Darla was quiet through the entire recounting. This was unusual. Darla was quiet in the way that a weather system is quiet in the seconds before it announces itself. Then she said, "Elsa. Your grandmother Elsa." "Yes." "Who drove the same car for 21 years." "Yes." "Nora," Darla said, and her voice broke briefly before she collected it. She knew. She knew about Marcus before you did. Nora had thought about this. About the timing of the property transfer, made in the first year of the marriage. About the 11 subsequent years during which Elsa had lived and watched, and said nothing, and continued maintaining the cabin and the cellar and the building and the collection. About what a woman of Elsa's intelligence and her specific variety of patient attention would have seen in those 11 years, and what she would have done about it. "She built me a way out," Nora said, "before I knew I needed one." Darla cried. Not loudly, because Darla believed that crying loudly was a form of performance, and she was not performing. She cried the way she did everything she took seriously, with full attention and without apology, and when she was done she asked the question she'd clearly been holding since the beginning of the call. "What does this mean? In numbers? What is the actual number? Gerald won't give me a final number until everything is assessed, and I've decided on an approach to market. But his preliminary estimate for the coins alone was 400,000 to 600,000. The stamps could match that or exceed it. The paintings, the ones I can compare to auction records, are probably another 1.5 million, maybe more. The manuscript is in its own category. He won't estimate the manuscript." Darla was quiet again. "Nora, what is the low end of the full picture?" Nora had done the math herself, from the floor up, using only the numbers she could verify and not the ones she couldn't. She'd been doing it for 3 weeks the way she'd been doing everything, methodically, without allowing wishful thinking to do arithmetic on her behalf. "The low end," she said carefully, "is somewhere around $3 million. The phone was very quiet for a long moment. "And Marcus," Darla said finally, and there was something in her voice that was not quite satisfaction but was in its neighborhood, "gave you $47. He forgot about a $1 cabin." She heard Darla let out a long breath. She heard Priya in the background asking something about dinner. She heard the specific quiet of a friendship that had been holding her up for months and would continue to do so, the reliable warmth of someone who had offered a couch without conditions and wanted nothing in return except to know she was going to be all right. She was going to be all right. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The numismatic specialist Gerald sent arrived in mid-January, a compact, deliberate man named Howard Ashe who had spent 30 years as a senior specialist at a major auction house and who examined the coin collection with the focused attention of someone for whom coins were not a hobby or an investment, but a language he happened to speak fluently. He spent 2 days in the cellar. He spent a third day on the phone with 2 colleagues he trusted, discussing specific pieces in terms Nora could follow from her weeks of self-education. Terms like key date and registry set and population report. On the 4th day, he gave her a formal preliminary estimate. The graded collection in the wooden crates alone was worth between $750,000 and $900,000 at current market, depending on the venue and timing of sale. The mason jar coins, many of which were ungraded but whose condition he could assess by eye, would require professional grading before sale, but were likely to add a further $200,000 to $300,000. He used the word conservatively 3 times in the course of explaining these numbers, each time with the particular emphasis of a man who understood that conservatively was itself a form of statement. She thanked him and walked out to the porch after he left and stood in the January cold looking at the view and felt the numbers settle into her body with a physical weight, the way that large things settle when you finally stop trying to hold them at arm's length and let them become real. The philatelic specialist came in February. She was a woman in her 60s named Caroline Voigt who arrived with a briefcase of reference materials and a magnifying loupe on a cord around her neck and who made a sound, when she first saw the stamp trays, that was not professional but was entirely honest. A brief intake of breath, quickly controlled, the sound of expertise encountering something it had not expected to encounter at this latitude and in this setting. The Curtis Jenny invert was genuine. Caroline confirmed it in the first hour, using the loupe and a set of comparison references she'd brought precisely because she'd been told there might be something in this collection worth preparing for. The stamp was genuine, she said, and it was graded and certified from a prior assessment that Elsa had arranged decades ago. The documentation in the estate files Nora had found, and a single example of the inverted Jenny in the grade and condition of this one had sold at auction 3 years prior for just over $1.1 million. There were other stamps. Not at that level, not individually, but cumulatively. The early American issues, the Confederate States material, the airmail period, the 19th century foreign material that Nora had not fully inventoried because she hadn't known how to read it. Caroline worked through all of it with the same focused patience, dictating into a small recorder she carried in her breast pocket, building the assessment from the bottom up the way Nora had learned to approach every element of this. The full stamp collection, Caroline told her 3 days later, sitting at the same wooden table where Gerald had sat, with the same fire burning in the same stone fireplace and a cup of the same tea, was her preliminary estimate of between $1.4 and $1.9 million in total. The numbers were accumulating in Nora's notebook the way they'd accumulated in Elsa's journals. She kept her own running tally in the back of the notebook, updating it after each specialist visit, each figure entered in the same small, precise handwriting she'd been cultivating in the months since she'd arrived here, as if proximity to Elsa's exactness had transferred itself through the act of living in her place. The silver went to a specialist in Richmond who drove up on a Saturday in March, assessed the tea service and the flatware and the objects in a single morning, and identified the maker's marks as belonging to a London silversmith active in the 1780s and 1790s whose work appeared in major museum collections. The silver, he told her, was worth between $140,000 and $180,000. The timepieces went to a horologist in Charlottesville whose opinion confirmed what the quality of the cases had suggested. 3 of the 6 watches were of significant collector interest, their makers' names well established in the horological world, their condition exceptional. The 3 significant pieces were worth, he estimated, between $90,000 and $130,000 combined. The paintings took the longest because the question of attribution required the most careful work. An art historian Gerald had recommended, a woman named Dr. Patricia Moreau who held a position at a university in Maryland and who specialized in American art of the 19th and early 20th centuries, came to the stone building, and spent 4 days examining the canvases with an intensity that excluded conversation, emerging each evening to eat the dinner Nora made and discuss what she'd seen. The 2 unsigned canvases were her primary focus. She had brought samples of comparative materials, photographs of attributed works, analyses of paint composition from a laboratory she used for authentication questions. On the 5th day, she came to the kitchen table with notes she'd clearly written at length and delivered her assessment in the careful, caveat-heavy language of an academic who understood that certainty and attribution was rarely available and had learned to say exactly what she could and could not confirm. 6 of the 9 canvases she could attribute with confidence, she said, for to named minor masters of the period whose recent market performance was documented. 2 to a single artist whose retrospective had driven the market substantially. Those 2 alone were worth, at current prices, between $800,000 and $1.2 million combined. The attribution was strong. She could write it up in terms that a major auction house would accept. The remaining 3 were more complicated. One she could not attribute at all and recommended they treat as a work of uncertain authorship until further research could be done. One she believed was attributable to a well-documented artist, but the evidence required additional technical analysis she would need laboratory support to complete. The 9th canvas, the unsigned one, was the reason she had stayed 5 days instead of 3. She set a folder on the table and opened it to a photograph. "This is a documented work by the same hand," she said. She turned to another photograph. "This is what I believe you have. The compositional similarities, the paint handling, the support material, the provenance trail in your grandmother's purchase records which indicate she acquired this from an estate sale in 1977 where it was listed as unsigned work in the manner of the American school. It would not have sold for much. Nothing about what was known at the time would have suggested what I believe this is." "What do you believe it is?" Nora asked. Dr. Morrow looked at her steadily. "I believe it is an early work by a painter who was largely unknown in 1977 and who is not unknown now. If the technical analysis confirms my attribution, and I have arranged for that analysis to proceed next month at my university's conservation laboratory, this canvas is worth between $2 and $3 million at current auction." Nora set down her tea mug. "This is preliminary," Dr. Morrow said. "The attribution has to be confirmed. I am giving you my professional opinion pending that confirmation." "I understand. Your grandmother bought it for," she checked her notes, $14. "At a church estate sale in the Shenandoah Valley." She wrote in her journal that she bought it because the light in it reminded her of the view from the porch. Nora looked at the window, at the view her grandmother had chosen this place for. The valley and the creek and the mountains in their layers going blue and gray against the sky. "She kept building things," Nora said quietly, "even when she wasn't trying." Dr. Morrow looked at her for a moment with an expression that had moved beyond professional. "The view," she said, "is remarkable." The manuscript was last. Gerald had been careful, patient, deliberate about who he recommended for it, making calls over the course of 3 months before he identified the right combination of expertise and discretion. The scholar he sent was a paleographer from a university in Virginia, a quiet man named Dr. Emil Brandt who had spent his career studying documents from the early modern period and who had been in correspondence with Gerald about the item's general characteristics before he came. He stayed for 6 days. He took the manuscript to the university under an agreement Nora had reviewed with an attorney before she allowed it to leave the property. It would be examined under controlled conditions, documented photographically, tested for paper and ink composition using non-invasive methods, and returned within 30 days. She kept copies of everything. She trusted the process because Gerald vouched for it, and because trust, she was learning to distinguish again, was not the same as naivety. Trust with documentation was due diligence. Naivety was trust without it. Dr. Brandt returned with the manuscript and with a written report 32 pages long. He sat at the kitchen table with Nora and went through it section by section in the quiet, unhurried way of a scholar who had learned that the most important information deserved the most care in its delivery. The manuscript was genuine. The paper and ink analyses were consistent with production in the first quarter of the 16th century, the range centering on 1515 to 1530, consistent with the date inscribed on the first page. The script was identified as a skilled chancery hand used in German-speaking regions of the Holy Roman Empire during this period. The text was a secular one, a travel account, written by a merchant describing a journey through the Eastern Mediterranean. It was not an illuminated manuscript in the traditional sense, but it was decorated with marginal annotations and small pen drawings of the places described that were of genuine art historical interest. The provenance was partial. He had been able to trace the manuscript's history back to a Swiss private collection from which it had apparently dispersed after the Second World War, a period during which many such documents changed hands through routes that were difficult to reconstruct. Elsa's journal documented her acquisition in 1971 from a book dealer in Baltimore who had acquired it from an estate. The price she had paid was $45. A manuscript of this period, this character, and this preservation quality, Dr. Brandt said, his voice measured and exact, would be of genuine interest to a major auction house. I would recommend Sotheby's or Christie's Books and Manuscripts Department, both of which have sold comparable items. The market for early modern secular manuscripts is specific, and I would not give you a precise estimate because the outcome depends significantly on how it is presented and who is in the room on the day of the sale. What I can tell you is that the range of outcomes I would consider realistic begins at approximately $1 million, and the upper end is not something I would be comfortable predicting with confidence. He paused. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. I have been examining documents from this period for 34 years, he said. The condition of this manuscript is exceptional. Your grandmother understood what it required to preserve paper, and she provided it. That matters enormously. Nora looked at the oilcloth bundle that held the manuscript, sitting at the end of the table where Dr. Brandt had placed it with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. She bought it for $45, Nora said. He looked at her with a small expression that contained years of professional experience and a great deal of genuine feeling for old things. She knew what she had, he said simply. People who know what they have take care of it. The total assessment came together in Nora's notebook over the course of those months with the slow, accumulating weight of a river rising. She updated the column in the back page after each specialist delivered their preliminary estimate, working from conservative figures only, using the low end of each range, refusing to let optimism do her arithmetic for her. Gerald reviewed her calculations in a phone call in early April, correcting her on 2 points where she'd been more conservative than the evidence warranted, and confirmed what her own numbers were approaching. She wrote the final conservative total at the bottom of the column and underlined it twice, the same way her grandmother underlined important things. $3,800,000. Conservative. Before the manuscript's auction result, and before the attribution of the 9th painting was confirmed. If both of those resolved favorably, and Dr. Brandt and Dr. Morrow both believe they would, the total would exceed $6 million, perhaps considerably. Marcus learned about the collection in March, not from Nora and not through any channel she'd deliberately opened. She didn't know exactly how he learned. What she knew was that his attorney sent her a letter on the 14th of March that she recognized immediately for what it was, an attempt, careful and precisely worded, to suggest that the collection might be considered marital property, given that Nora had owned the cabin during the marriage and had therefore potentially accrued value in the property during the years they were together. She read the letter twice. Then she called the attorney she'd retained in January, a woman named Frances Cole who had 30 years of estate law experience and who had reviewed the property transfer documentation and the collection purchase records before accepting Nora as a client. Frances was not concerned. The property had been transferred to Nora by name before the marriage. The collection had been purchased entirely by Elsa using Elsa's funds over the course of 40 years, the last purchase predating the marriage by 8 years according to the journal records. The collection had passed to Nora through Elsa's estate, not through any marital asset. There was no legal basis for Marcus's inquiry, Frances said, and the fact that his attorney had framed the letter carefully rather than assertively told her that his attorney understood this and was testing rather than claiming. She drafted a response, Frances did, and sent it. She did not hear from Marcus's attorney again. She heard from Marcus directly, once. He called in early April. On an evening, she was sitting on the porch watching the last of the winter give way to the first warmth of spring, the trees beginning the soft, tentative bloom that preceded full leaf. The creek was louder now with snowmelt. The mountains had a different color, something warmer at their lower slopes, the first suggestion of green returning. She almost didn't answer. Then she did, because she was not the same woman she'd been in November, and she understood now that there were conversations you didn't avoid if you wanted to be done with them. He didn't say much. His voice had the careful quality of a man choosing his words, which was how she'd always known him to speak, and which she'd once mistaken for thoughtfulness. He said he'd heard she'd found something at the cabin. He said he hoped she was doing well. He said it in the tone of someone waiting to be given information, and she didn't give him any. She told him she was doing fine. She told him the cabin had turned out to be a good investment. She said it without emphasis, without drama, without the satisfaction she might have imagined feeling in this moment, because the satisfaction, when it came, was quieter than she'd expected and turned inward rather than outward. It was not about Marcus. It had stopped being about Marcus somewhere around the 4th week in the cabin, when she'd opened the 3rd wooden crate and read her grandmother's journal entry from 1963 and understood that what was happening here had nothing to do with him. He offered a vague formulation about staying in touch. She said she'd think about it. She ended the call and sat on the porch with her phone in her lap and watched the mountains hold their shape against the pale April sky. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something more durable than triumph. She felt finished with a particular kind of weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped knowing it was there. It had put itself down somewhere between the trapdoor and the stone building, and she hadn't noticed until this moment when she reached for it and found only air. The first auction was in June, at a specialist numismatic house in Philadelphia that Howard Ashe had recommended. She brought 17 coins from the graded collection, specifically chosen with his guidance, representing a range of types and periods that would appeal to different segments of the collector market. She attended in person because she decided she wanted to be there for the first time. She converted any part of Elsa's collection into the form that Elsa had presumably intended it to eventually take. She sat in the back of the room. She wore a jacket she'd bought at a thrift store in Charlottesville, and which she planned to replace soon, but which felt right for this occasion. For some reason, she didn't analyze. She watched the room fill with people who knew what they were doing and why they were there, and she felt entirely calm. The first coin went for $43,000. A Morgan dollar in a grade that Howard had explained was rare for its date, a coin for which the bidding opened at $12,000 and climbed in increments that accelerated as the room narrowed to 2 bidders, and then one. $43,000 for a coin her grandmother had purchased, she knew from the records, for $60 at an estate sale in 1974. She sat very still and watched the auctioneer's gavel come down and felt her grandmother's 40 years of patience arrive in the room like a presence, like someone standing just at the edge of her vision who was pleased. The 17 coins she'd brought sold in total for $412,000. She drove back to the cabin that evening on roads she knew by heart now, the interstate and then the county route, and then the secondary road that narrowed to a lane between the trees, and she pulled into the gravel drive and sat for a moment with the engine off. The mountains were purple at their tops in the long summer evening, the sky above them a deep, clear blue that was the particular blue of the Virginia mountains in June, a color she had no name for except the one she'd given it in her mind over the months she'd been here. Elsa's blue. She went inside and built a small fire despite the warmth of the evening because the fire felt right, felt like a companion and not a necessity, and she made tea and sat at the wooden table and opened the last page of her notebook and looked at the number she'd written there in February. $412,000 subtracted from the conservative total left a balance that was still, even now, larger than anything she'd ever held in her hands in her life. The assessment process continued. The manuscript and the painting were still months from resolution. The rest of the collection would go to market over the course of the next 2 years, Gerald had advised, strategically timed to avoid flooding any single segment of the market and to catch the right moments in the auction cycle. But she had $412,000 in a bank account with her name on it, a fact so new and so unlike anything her recent life had prepared her for that she kept having to remind herself it was true. Not in the way of someone who distrusted good fortune, but in the way of someone who wanted to receive it fully rather than partially, who wanted to let it become real rather than holding it at a distance where it felt theoretical. She called Darla that night. She told her about the auction. She told her the number. She heard Darla sit down somewhere, the particular sound of a person needing the support of a chair. Then she told Darla what she'd decided to do, and that was a different kind of call. She was paying off Darla's apartment lease for the next 2 years. This was not negotiable, she told Darla before Darla could speak, because Darla had given her a couch and coffee and a Priya who drew pictures of cabins with oversized suns, and those things had kept her from coming apart at a moment when coming apart was a genuine possibility, and money was one of the ways she knew how to say thank you that would last. Darla cried again, this time not quietly. She was also setting up a small education fund for Priya, which Darla didn't find out about until later when the documentation arrived. She hired a contractor to properly restore the cabin, not to improve it, not to modernize it or make it into something it wasn't, but to fix what time had done to what Elsa had built, replace the section of shingles that the moss had won, reset the porch, refinish the floors, properly insulate the bedroom where the stovepipe needed to be reseated. She was particular about what she asked for. She showed the contractor photographs of the cabin as she'd found it and told him she wanted the cabin to look like someone had been taking care of it for a long time, which it had been, and which she intended to continue. She had not decided yet whether to sell the collection entirely or to keep portions of it. The coins would be sold gradually, as Howard recommended. The stamps would go to a major philatelic auction in the fall. The silver and the timepieces she would sell in the spring, at a venue Caroline and Gerald agreed was appropriate for the quality of what she had. The manuscript, she was in conversation with a museum about a possible institutional acquisition, which would produce a different kind of result than an open auction, and which Dr. Brandt felt was the appropriate context for the document, given its historical character. The 9th painting was confirmed in September. Dr. Moreau called her on a Tuesday morning in early fall, her voice carrying the careful restraint of someone who'd been holding something large for a long time and was releasing it slowly. The attribution is confirmed, she said. The technical analysis and the additional comparative research I've done over the summer support the attribution fully. I've written it up, and I'm confident in presenting it to a major auction house. Nora was standing on the porch when the call came. The mountains were doing the thing they did in September, going gold and orange at the lower slopes while the sky behind them went impossibly clear and deep. The creek was audible in the valley, its September voice different from summer, lower and more deliberate. What are we talking about? Nora asked. Dr. Moreau was quiet for a moment. I consulted with a colleague at Sotheby's last week. Preliminary, informal. 2.3 to 2.8 million, she said, based on comparable sales in the past 18 months. If the market is favorable on the day, it could go higher. Nora stood on the porch and looked at the view her grandmother had chosen this place for. The view that had reminded Elsa of the light in a painting she'd found at a church estate sale for $14. A painting she'd lived with in a stone building on a hill in Virginia for over 30 years, and whose light she'd carried with her every time she looked out at these mountains. She built things even when she wasn't trying, Nora had said to Dr. Moreau in April. She understood now what she'd meant. Elsa hadn't been trying to build a collection worth millions. She'd been paying attention. To value, to care, to the simple practice of looking at the world closely enough to see what it actually contained rather than what people said it was worth. The money was the consequence of the attention, not the goal. The goal had always been something else, something that Nora understood now the way she understood. The view from the porch, not as information but as knowledge that lived in the body, in the chest, in the way you breathed when you stood at the edge of a mountain valley on a clear September morning and felt the cold coming off the hills. The goal had been to prove that a life lived carefully and on its own terms, without permission or validation or anyone telling you what you were allowed to want, was a life that accumulated. That the things you built in the quiet, the things you learned and preserved and maintained when no one was watching, were real. That they lasted. That they mattered in the end in a way that other things did not. Nora had the final total written in her notebook by November, a full year after she'd driven up the gravel drive in Darla's Honda and found the cabin standing in the November light. The conservative total had been 3.8 million. The confirmed total, with the painting attribution and the museum's offer for the manuscript accepted and the first rounds of auction complete, was just over $6 million. Gerald told her the remaining collection, to be sold over the next 18 months, was likely to bring the final number to somewhere between 7 and 8 million, depending on timing and market conditions. She read it a few times. Then she closed the notebook and went and stood on the porch. She was not the same person who had signed the divorce papers with $47 in her account. She understood that without sentimentality, the way you understood things that were simply true, the money had changed her circumstances. What had changed her was the year. The year of the fire, and the cellar, and the journals, and the specialists, and the slow, careful work of learning what she had and what it meant. The year of understanding that her grandmother had built her a way out before she knew she needed one and had trusted her to find it. She had found it. She had found it the way Elsa had built it, alone, carefully, without rushing. The key to the stone building was on a hook by the back door now, where she'd hung it in January when she'd stopped needing to search for it. She looked at it in passing sometimes, the old iron heavy with its particular weight, and thought about what Elsa had felt when she locked it. Whether she'd locked it with the specific knowledge of who would eventually open it, or whether she'd simply trusted the future to send the right person, which amounted, in the end, to the same thing. She walked back inside and added a log to the fire, and stood at the window, and looked at the mountains going blue in the early evening, the last of the daylight pulling away from the valley below, the creek invisible now but audible, its steady voice carrying up the hill through the cold autumn air. She thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not the money, not the specific items her grandmother had chosen and kept and prepared. What it meant to inherit a way of being in the world. The understanding that value accrued slowly and in secret and through attention, not through performance. That the most important things were built in the quiet, in the space where nobody was watching, in the years before you were needed. Elsa had been building for 40 years toward a future she couldn't specify, toward a need she could sense without being able to name it. She had built without telling anyone, without asking for credit, without allowing the smallness of what it looked like from the outside to discourage what she knew about what it was on the inside. A cabin worth $1. An inheritance worth $8 million. The fire crackled behind her. The mountains held their shape in the fading light. The creek kept talking in the valley below, the way it had been talking for centuries, the way it would keep talking long after the cabin and the building and all the careful work of all the patient lives that had moved through this place were eventually folded back into the earth. Nora stood at the window and let the quiet fill the room around her, let it settle into the corners and across the worn pine floors and up through the rafters above the stone chimney and out into the cold mountain air. And she understood that this was what Elsa had been trying to tell her, had been building toward telling her for 40 years. That the world contained more than it appeared. That the overlooked things, the things valued at nothing by the people who moved through the world too quickly to look at them closely, were often the things that had been waiting longest. That patience was not passive. That silence was not absence. That a woman who drove the same car for 21 years and wore her shoes until they wore through was not a woman without ambition. She was a woman whose ambition had a longer horizon than most people were willing to wait for. She had waited. She had built. She had left what she'd built in a place she knew would eventually be found by someone who needed it and who would know what to do with it. She had been right about all of it. Nora turned from the window, made tea, sat at the table her grandmother had sat at, and opened a new notebook, the first page blank and waiting, and wrote the date at the top in small, precise letters, slightly slanted. Then she began. Not a list this time. Not an inventory or a tally or a running calculation of what she had or what it might be worth. What she wrote on the first page of the new notebook was something she hadn't written before, something she was only now ready to write, because you couldn't write it before you understood it, and she was only now understanding it. The way you came to understand the most important things, not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing the next, each one requiring the one before it. She wrote about Elsa. She wrote about what it meant to build something for 40 years in silence, and to trust the building itself to outlast you, to find its purpose after you were gone. She wrote about the cabin and the cellar and the stone building and the trees and the key on the nail in the back of the cabinet and all the small, deliberate things her grandmother had left behind for someone with enough patience and enough need to notice them. She wrote slowly and without stopping, the way she'd been learning to do things since November, without rushing to the conclusion, letting the middle of the thing have its full weight before she arrived at the end. Outside, the November mountains were going dark in the early evening the way they'd gone dark on the first evening she'd spent here, the year closing its circle around her, the seasons completing themselves over the hills and the creek and the bare trees that had already lost their autumn color and stood waiting for winter with the patience of things that knew how to wait. She thought about what Darla had said on that first call, the one in early December when Nora had told her the whole of it. She said it knowing you would need it, before you knew you needed it. She had been trying to understand, in the months since, whether that was grief or grace or some combination of the two. Whether it made her sad that her grandmother had seen what was coming before she had built a safety net in silence while Nora was still trusting the floor she was standing on. Whether it should feel like failure, not to have seen it herself. Whether it should feel like loss, that Elsa had known and said nothing. She had decided it felt like neither. It felt like love in the specific form that love took in women of Elsa's generation and temperament, not demonstrative, not verbal, not even visible until the moment it became necessary. Invisible, accumulated, carefully maintained. Waiting in the dark to be useful. The fire needed a log. She got up and added one and stood for a moment watching it take. The new wood going from dark to bright as the heat found it, the flames adjusting their shape around the addition. The cabin around her was warm and quiet and entirely hers. She thought about what she would do with what remained of the next year. After the collection was fully sold and the final accounting was closed and the number in her notebook had settled into its permanent form. Gerald had advised her to work with a financial advisor she trusted, to approach the management of the proceeds with the same care Elsa had brought to the accumulation of them. She was taking that advice. Moving too fast was how you miss things. Moving too fast was how a person ended up with $47 and a borrowed couch. She was not moving too fast. She had also thought carefully about what the collection itself had taught her, beyond the money, beyond the financial transformation that was already well underway. What it had taught her was harder to write down and harder to explain, and more valuable than anything she'd found in the cellar or the stone building. It was the lesson of Elsa's journals, the lesson she'd been reading every night for months in the careful daily entries of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had never needed anyone else to know it too. Value was everywhere. It was in things people overlooked because they didn't know how to look, or because looking took too long, or because the return on the looking wasn't immediately obvious. It was in the thing assessed at $1 and left off the asset disclosure because nobody had time to consider it carefully. It was in the woman across the table who had been dismissed as an asset because she was no longer performing according to someone else's metrics. It was in the patience to stay with something long enough to understand what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be. She had inherited more than a collection. She had inherited a way of seeing. She wrote that in the notebook, not because it needed to be recorded, but because writing was how she made things fully real, how she confirmed for herself that she'd actually arrived at the understanding and not just at its neighborhood. She had inherited a way of seeing. She intended to use it. The log she'd added had caught fully now, the fire steady and bright behind the screen, its warmth filling the main room of the cabin in the way that would heat filled rooms, not from a single source, but from everywhere at once, the walls and the floor and the air itself warming around her. She sat at the table until the notebook page was full, and then she set down the pen and looked at what she'd written. The handwriting was small and precise and slightly slanted. She had not noticed when that had happened. But somewhere in the months of living in Elsa's place and handling Elsa's things and reading Elsa's journals, her handwriting had become something it had never been before. Something that looked, when she held the page at a distance and saw it without trying to read it, like the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship as a discipline rather than a preference. She closed the notebook. She put it on the shelf above the table where she kept the other notebooks she'd filled over the course of the year, the inventory notebooks and the research notebooks and the planning notebooks, a row of them now, the record of a year spent understanding what she had. Then she put on her grandmother's coat and went out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, the sky enormous and bright with stars. The Milky Way a sweep of light across the southern sky that she'd been watching for a year now, and which still stopped her the same way it had stopped her the first night. The creek was there in the valley below, its voice steady and patient, and without any sense of urgency, a sound that had been running through these mountains for longer than anyone could imagine. She stood on the porch in the cold with her hands in the pockets of Elsa's coat, and felt the mountain hold her still the way it held everything still, The way it had been holding Elsa still in all the years she'd stood in this exact spot looking at this exact sky. Elsa had been right about this place, about what it gave you if you let it. The thing that was harder to name than any of the things in the cellar or the building, harder to document or value or sell at auction, the thing that couldn't be put in a mason jar or a sealed case or an acid-free box, and which was therefore the most important thing of all. The quiet, the view, the creek, the particular, irreplaceable education of standing alone in the dark in a place that belonged to you, looking at something so large it made your own life feel both small and entirely sufficient, both temporary and completely worth the trouble. She stood there for a long time, not thinking exactly, not planning or calculating or inventing the next step, just being where she was, in the dark and the cold and the starlight, in the cabin her grandmother had called her thinking place, in the year that had changed everything, in the life that was beginning now from the ground up, built on the foundation that Elsa had been laying for 40 years in the quiet. Then she went inside. She added a final log to the fire. She made tea. She sat at the table and opened the notebook to the last page she'd written on and read it once, carefully, the way her grandmother had read things. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.